Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a forest ranger for 15 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things in these woods. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. The night I realized we weren't alone out here. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. I was on my usual night patrol, checking for any signs of illegal camping or poaching. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, and a light mist was settling in among the trees. As I made my way along the familiar trail, my flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet, no chirping of nightbirds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the whole woods were holding its breath. I tried to brush off the unease, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But then I saw it, a set of tracks in the soft earth beside the trail. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched down to examine them more closely. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. A bear, maybe, but these weren't bear tracks. They were too elongated, too human-like. And besides, we hadn't had any reported bear sightings in this area for years. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I did so. Whatever had made these tracks was big, and it was close. I radioed back to base, keeping my voice low as I reported the unusual footprints. They told me to continue my patrol, but to stay alert and call in at the first sign of any real danger. As I stood up and shined my light down the trail, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, searching the shadows between the trees for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a sharp crack of a breaking branch, followed by a deep, rumbling breath that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded in my chest as I swung my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but all I could see were trees and mist. "Hello!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Ranger Mike. Is anyone out there?" Silence was my only answer, but I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I took a few cautious steps forward, my free hand resting on the pepper spray at my belt. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing if I encountered an aggressive animal. Another crack, this time closer. I spun around, my light beam catching a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. It was gone in an instant, but the image was burned into my mind, a hulking, hair-covered form that walked on two legs. My training kicked in, and I began to back away slowly, never taking my eyes off the spot where I'd seen the creature. "And this is Ranger Mike." I spoke into my radio, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've got a situation here. I need backup. Now." As I waited for a response, I heard heavy footsteps circling around me, always just out of sight. Whatever this thing was, it was smart. It was herding me, cutting off my escape routes one by one. The radio crackled to life, the voice of my colleague, Sarah, filling the air. "Mike, what's your location? What kind of situation?" Before I could respond, a low, guttural growl emanated from the darkness behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam catching two gleaming eyes reflecting back at me. They were set high off the ground, at least 7 or 8 feet up, and they were unmistakably intelligent. "Oh, God," I breathed, stumbling backward. "There's something out here, Sarah. Something big. I don't know what it is." "Mike, calm down." Sarah's voice came through, tinged with concern. "Where are you? We're sending help." But I couldn't answer. I was transfixed by those eyes, watching as the massive form they belonged to stepped forward into the edge of my light. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, a creature that seemed to be an impossible mix of man and beast. Thick, Matted fur covered its body, and its face was a twisted approximation of something almost human, but not quite. I fumbled for my pepper spray, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it. The creature took another step forward, and I could see its muscles rippling beneath its fur. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and let out a roar that shook me to my very core. That's when my fight-or-flight instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail or my own safety. Branches whipped at my face, and roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footfalls and labored breathing growing closer with each passing second. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I pushed on. I had to get back to my truck, to safety, but in my panic I'd lost all sense of direction. The trees all looked the same in the darkness, and I realized with growing horror that I was hopelessly lost. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was right there, barely 10 feet behind me. I could see the hunger in its eyes, the primal desire to hunt and kill. Just when I thought it was all over, my foot caught on a root, and I went sprawling to the ground. I rolled onto my back, expecting to feel the creature's claws tearing into me at any moment, but instead I found myself staring up at an empty patch of sky between the trees. The creature was gone. I lay there for what felt like hours, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Slowly, cautiously, I sat up and looked around. The forest was quiet once again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. The normal sounds of the night had returned, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. On shaky legs, I got to my feet and tried to get my bearings. In the distance, I could hear voices calling my name. My backup had arrived. As I made my way towards the sound of their voices, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of gleaming eyes. Every rustle of leaves could be the creature waiting to pounce. When I finally stumbled into the clearing where my colleagues were gathered, I was a mess, covered in dirt and scratches, wild-eyed and babbling about the creature I'd seen. They listened patiently, exchanged worried glances, and gently suggested that maybe the stress of the job was getting to me, but I knew what I'd seen. And as we made our way back to the ranger station, I couldn't help but look back at the dark line of trees. Something was out there, something that defied explanation, and I had a feeling that this wouldn't be the last time our paths crossed. In the days and weeks that followed, I pored over every book and website I could find about cryptids and unexplained creatures. I became obsessed with finding an explanation for what I'd encountered that night. My colleagues worried about me, and even I had to admit that I was walking a fine line between determination and madness. But then the reports started coming in. Hikers describing strange noises in the night. Campers finding their sites destroyed by something far larger and stronger than a bear. And always, those massive footprints in the soft earth. I know now that I'm not crazy. There's something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't exist but does. And as I sit here writing this down, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, watching and waiting? And more importantly, when will it decide to make itself known to the world? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at those woods the same way again, and neither should you. Because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting for its moment to strike. Story 2. The forest was never truly silent, even in the dead of night. There was always the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, or the gentle whisper of the wind through the pines. But that night, as I patrolled the familiar trails of the national park, the usual symphony of the woods had been replaced by an eerie stillness that settled over the landscape like a thick fog. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My name is Jack, and I've been a park ranger for over a decade. I know these woods like the back of my hand. Every tree, every rock, Every winding path is etched into my memory. But that night, as I walked the trails under the pale light of the moon, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. It was as if the forest was watching me, waiting for me to make a wrong move. I had started my patrol just after sunset, as I always did. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and the sky was a tapestry of stars. I had my flashlight in one hand and my radio clipped to my belt. My boots crunched softly on the gravel path as I made my way deeper into the woods. The first hour passed uneventfully, and I began to relax, letting the familiar routine lull me into a false sense of security. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps trailing behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, and listened. The forest was silent again, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight over the trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just shadows and branches swaying gently in the breeze. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. I'd been on edge all week, thanks to reports of strange sightings in the area. Campers had mentioned seeing a large, shadowy figure lurking near their sites, and a few hikers had claimed to hear low growls echoing through the trees. Most of the rangers dismissed these stories as overactive imaginations or tricks of the light, but I wasn't so sure. I continued on my patrol, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Every few minutes I would hear those footsteps again, keeping pace with me, just out of sight. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest, and tried to focus on the path ahead. The beam of my flashlight danced over the ground, illuminating the way forward, but my mind was racing. The trail led me to a small clearing, where I paused to catch my breath. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. I scanned the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever was following me. But the clearing was empty, save for the rustling leaves and the distant call of a night bird. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, footsteps, closer this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I swung the flashlight around, my heart thundering in my ears, and caught sight of a pair of eyes reflecting the light, just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were large, unblinking, and too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal. I froze, my mind racing through the possibilities. It couldn't be a bear. They didn't have eyes like that. And it wasn't a wolf or a coyote. Whatever it was watching me with an unsettling intensity, as if weighing its options. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate. The eyes followed me, never blinking, never wavering. I could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy and oppressive, as if they were boring into my very soul. The growl came again, low and menacing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the trail, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each step. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I could hear the footsteps behind me, gaining ground, and I pushed myself to run faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my radio, desperately trying to call for backup. My fingers trembled as I pressed the button, my voice shaky and breathless. "This is Ranger Jack. I need assistance on the North Trail. Possible animal encounter. I repeat, I need assistance." Static crackled in response, and I cursed under my breath. The radio signal was weak out here, and I couldn't be sure if anyone had heard me. I glanced over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving swiftly through the trees. It was large, much larger than any animal I'd ever seen, and it moved with an unnatural grace. I stumbled, nearly losing my footing, but managed to stay upright. The trail twisted and turned, and I followed it blindly, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. I could still hear the footsteps, relentless and unyielding, and the growl that seemed to reverberate through the very air. Finally, I burst out onto a wider path, one that led back towards the ranger station. The sight of it filled me with a surge of hope, and I pushed myself to run even faster. The station was a small, sturdy building nestled among the trees, a beacon of safety in the dark forest. I reached the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The footsteps were closer now, almost upon me, and I could feel the presence of whatever was following me, looming just out of sight. I managed to unlock the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, and listened. The footsteps had stopped, and the growl had faded into the night. I was safe, at least for the moment. But the memory of those eyes, watching me from the shadows, lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of what lurked in the depths of the forest. I knew I couldn't ignore it, couldn't dismiss it as a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. Something was out there, something that didn't belong, and it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known again. I had to warn the others, had to make sure we were prepared for whatever was coming. As I sat there, catching my breath and trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The forest had always been a place of mystery and wonder, but now it held a new, terrifying secret. And I was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took. Story 3. I've always loved camping, but after what happened that night in the Elderwood Forest, I don't think I'll ever sleep under the stars again. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with friends. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. There were 4 of us. Me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Melissa, and my younger sister Sarah. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the city and lose ourselves in nature for a few days. If only we'd known what was waiting for us in those woods. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. The sun was already starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the small clearing we'd chosen for our site. As we set up our tents and gathered wood for the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, too still, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to being away from the constant noise of the city. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw something move just beyond the circle of light. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. It was well past midnight when we finally decided to turn in. As I zipped up my tent, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A scream, but not a human scream. This was something primal, something that didn't belong in these woods. Or any woods, for that matter. "Did you guys hear that?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "Hear what?" Jake responded, his head poking out of his tent. I was about to answer when the sound came again, closer this time. It was a mix between a howl and a roar, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. We all froze, listening intently as the echo faded away. "What the hell was that?" Melissa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just a coyote or something," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Let's just get some sleep. We've got a long hike planned for tomorrow." Reluctantly, we all retreated to our tents, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, listening to every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, and every so often, that terrible cry would echo through the forest, each time seeming to come from a different direction. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent to find the others already up. They looked as tired as I felt, with dark circles under their eyes. "Did anyone actually get any sleep last night?" Sarah asked, stifling a yawn. We all shook our heads. As we prepared breakfast, we tried to laugh off our fears from the night before, but the laughter died in our throats when we saw the state of our campsite. Our food supplies, which we'd carefully hung from a tree to keep away from bears, were scattered across the ground. The plastic containers were torn to shreds, their contents devoured, but it wasn't just the food. Our backpacks had been rifled through, their contents strewn about, and there, in the soft earth around our tents, were footprints. Massive footprints that looked almost human, but not quite. "What kind of animal could have done this?" Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake crouched down to examine one of the prints. "I've never seen anything like this before," he said, running his hand along the edge of the impression. "It's too big to be a bear, and the shape is all wrong." As we stood there, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, Sarah suddenly gasped, "Guys, look at the trees!" We turned to where she was pointing and felt our hearts sink. The trees surrounding our campsite were marked with deep, parallel gashes, claw marks that stretched far higher than any known animal in these parts could reach. "We need to get out of here," I said, already moving to break down my tent. "Now!" No one argued. We packed up our remaining supplies in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at every sound. As we shouldered our backpacks and prepared to leave, that bone-chilling cry echoed through the forest once more. It was close, too close. We set off down the trail at a brisk pace, eager to put as much distance between us and whatever had visited our camp in the night. But with each step, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed. About an hour into our hike, Jake called for a quick break. We paused in a small clearing, gratefully dropping our packs and taking long swigs from our water bottles. That's when we heard it, the snap of a branch, followed by heavy breathing that didn't belong to any of us. Slowly, we turned towards the sound. There, at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a massive oak, was a shape, a hulking, hair-covered form that stood on two legs. It was easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as a man's, but it was the eyes that struck me the most. Intelligent, almost human-like eyes that gleamed with a predatory intensity. For a moment, we all stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with this impossible creature. Then, as if a spell had been broken, we ran. We ran harder and faster than I thought possible, our packs bouncing painfully against our backs, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush. Its guttural roars spurred us on, terror lending wings to our feet, but it was gaining on us. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, smell the musty, animal scent of its fur. Just when I thought we couldn't run any further, the trees ahead thinned, and we burst out onto a dirt road. A pickup truck was parked there, an older man in a ranger's uniform leaning against it. He took one look at our terrified faces and the creature pursuing us and sprang into action. "Get in the truck," he yelled, already moving to the driver's side. We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the bed of the pickup, and the ranger gunned the engine. As we sped away, I risked a glance back. The creature had stopped at the tree line, watching us go. Even from this distance, I could see the intelligence in its eyes. This wasn't just some animal. It knew exactly what it was doing. The ranger drove us back to the main campground, where we gave our statements to the local authorities. They listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They talked about bears and mountain lions, about how fear can play tricks on the mind. But I knew what we'd seen. We all did. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with finding an explanation for what we'd encountered. I pored over cryptozoology websites, read every book I could find on Bigfoot and other mysterious creatures. I even went back to Elderwood Forest, though I couldn't bring myself to venture far from the main trails. I never saw the creature again, but sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear that bone-chilling cry echoing in the distance, and I know, deep in my bones, that it's still out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I can't look at a forest without wondering what might be hiding just beyond the tree line. The experience changed me, opened my eyes to the possibility that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, just out of sight. So the next time you're in the woods, and you hear a strange sound or see movement out of the corner of your eye, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the legends are true, and sometimes we're not alone in the wilderness. As for me, I still love nature. But these days, I do my camping in the backyard, where the only creatures I have to worry about are the neighbor's cat and the occasional raccoon, because I know now that there are some things in this world that are better left undiscovered, some mysteries that should remain unsolved. But if you do venture into the deep woods, keep your wits about you, and if you hear that cry in the night, run, run, and don't look back. Because you never know what might be watching you from the shadows. Story 4. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows that danced across the canvas of our tents. We were miles from the nearest trailhead, enveloped by the dense embrace of the forest. The isolation was intoxicating, a rare escape from the relentless hum of city life. But as the night deepened, an unsettling stillness settled over our campsite, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to interrupt the quiet. I'm Sarah, and my friends and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We craved the solitude, the chance to disconnect from the world and immerse ourselves in nature. There were 4 of us, me, James, Lisa, and Tom. We'd been friends since college, bonded by our love for adventure and the outdoors. This trip was supposed to be a celebration of that bond, a weekend of laughter and stories under the stars. We had set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets to the wind. The day had been perfect, blue skies, a gentle breeze, and the sun warming our backs as we hiked deeper into the wilderness. We'd spent the afternoon exploring, fishing in the nearby stream, and gathering wood for the fire. As dusk fell, we gathered around the flames, sharing stories and passing around a flask of whiskey to ward off the chill. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling settled over me, like a shadow creeping into the corners of my mind. The forest, once alive with the sounds of crickets and distant hoots of owls, had grown eerily silent. It was as if the woods were listening, waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the whiskey and the long day of hiking. But I couldn't ignore the way the shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of the firelight. I glanced at my friends, wondering if they felt it too, but they seemed oblivious, caught up in their own stories and laughter. It wasn't until we heard the first low growl that the mood shifted. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A deep, guttural rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. We fell silent, listening intently, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Probably just an animal," Tom said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the edge of uncertainty in his voice. James stood up, peering into the shadows. "I'll check it out," he said, reaching for the flashlight. "It's probably nothing." I watched as he moved towards the edge of the clearing, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances, each of us feeling the weight of the silence that had descended upon us. A few tense moments passed before James returned, shrugging off our worried looks. "Didn't see anything," he said, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Probably just a raccoon or something." We tried to laugh it off, returning to our conversation, but the atmosphere had shifted. The fire seemed to burn a little less brightly, the shadows encroaching upon our circle. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking our every move. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. One by one, my friends retreated to their tents, leaving me alone by the dying fire. I sat there for a while, staring into the embers, lost in thought. The forest was still, unnaturally so, and I felt a growing sense of unease. Finally, I stood up, brushing the dirt from my jeans, and headed to my tent. The zipper rasped loudly in the silence as I closed it behind me. I lay there, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But sleep eluded me, chased away by the nagging feeling that something was wrong. It was the sound of footsteps that finally pulled me from the edge of sleep. They were soft at first, barely audible over the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder, more insistent. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. The footsteps circled our campsite, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there was taking its time, savoring the moment. I held my breath, straining to hear, my mind racing with possibilities. It couldn't be an animal. The steps were too measured, too human. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling as I switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent, but I couldn't bring myself to unzip the door, to face whatever was out there. I lay there, listening, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent, as I waited for something to happen. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity, but the forest remained silent. I must have dozed off eventually, exhaustion finally overcoming my fear. When I awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the trees, casting a soft glow over the campsite. I sat up, blinking in the early morning light, trying to shake off the remnants of my restless night. The others were already up, gathered around the fire pit, their expressions tense and uneasy. I joined them, noting the dark circles under their eyes, the way they glanced nervously at the trees. "Did anyone else hear it?" I asked, breaking the silence. They nodded, their expressions grim. "It circled the tents," James said, his voice low. "I didn't want to say anything last night, but I saw something in the woods, a shadow, moving between the trees." Lisa shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I thought it was just my imagination," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it felt like we were being watched." We spent the morning packing up, our usual banter replaced by a heavy silence. None of us wanted to admit it, but the forest no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was as if the woods had turned against us, revealing a darker, more sinister side. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the forest remained silent, the shadows deep and impenetrable. When we finally reached the safety of our cars, relief washed over me, mingled with a lingering sense of unease. We said our goodbyes, each of us eager to return to the familiarity of civilization. But as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the forest, wondering what secrets it held and what might be lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Story 5. The warning sign was faded, its message obscured by time and the elements. "Trail closed," it read, in letters barely legible beneath the layers of moss and grime. It was the kind of sign that begged to be ignored, especially by those who sought adventure and the thrill of the unknown. We were those people, me and my best friend, Alex, drawn to the mystery of the forbidden path like moths to a flame. We had been hiking these woods for years, always seeking out the paths less traveled, the hidden gems that lay beyond the well-trodden trails. The closed trail had been on our radar for a while, whispered about among fellow hikers as a place of haunting beauty and unexplained occurrences. The stories were vague, filled with half-truths and speculation, but they were enough to pique our curiosity. The day we decided to ignore the sign was bright and clear, the kind of day that made the world feel alive with possibilities. We set out early, our packs filled with the essentials: water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a map that didn't include the trail we were intent on exploring. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves, the air crisp and invigorating. As we stepped past the sign, a thrill of excitement coursed through me, mingled with a tinge of apprehension. The trail was overgrown, the trees arching overhead to form a canopy that dappled the ground with sunlight and shadow. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, and I felt a sense of exhilaration at the thought of exploring a place that few had dared to tread. We walked in companionable silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the distant call of a bird. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, the underbrush thicker. I felt a sense of wonder at the beauty of it all, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting patterns on the forest floor. But as we continued, a sense of unease began to creep in. It was subtle at first, a feeling that something was off, that we were being watched. I shook it off, attributing it to the stories we'd heard, the way they had planted seeds of doubt in my mind. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each step we took. "Do you feel that?" Alex asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he were afraid of disturbing the stillness. I nodded, glancing around at the trees that seemed to close in on us. "Yeah, it's like we're not alone." We stopped, listening intently, but the forest was silent, too silent. The usual symphony of birds and insects had ceased, leaving a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed in on us from all sides. We exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us. We would go a little further, just to see what lay ahead, and then turn back. The thrill of discovery was still there, but it was tempered by a growing sense of caution. We continued on, our footsteps cautious, the trail narrowing as it wound deeper into the forest. The trees were ancient, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decay. As we rounded a bend, the trail opened up into a small clearing, bathed in dappled sunlight. It was beautiful, almost serene, but there was something unsettling about it. The feeling of being watched was stronger here, an almost tangible presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We paused, taking in the scene, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, large and deep, leading from the edge of the clearing into the trees. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, too large to belong to a human, and the sight of them sent a chill down my spine. "Alex, look at this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He joined me, his eyes widening as he took in the tracks. "What the hell made those?" he muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. The prints were fresh, the edges sharp and defined in the soft earth. I shook my head, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. "I don't know, but I think we should head back." He nodded, standing up and brushing the dirt from his hands. "Yeah, let's get out of here." We turned to leave, but as we did, a low growl rumbled through the clearing, reverberating through the trees. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, and it froze us in our tracks. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, a surge of adrenaline coursing through me. We exchanged a glance, fear mirrored in Alex's eyes, and without a word, we took off, racing back the way we had come. The forest seemed to blur around us as we ran, the trees a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. I could hear the pounding of my heart, the ragged gasps of my breath, and the echo of footsteps behind us, heavy, relentless, gaining ground with each passing second. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see what was chasing us. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, every instinct screaming at me to run faster, to get away from whatever was pursuing us. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the path twisting and turning, each bend revealing more of the same dense forest. I could feel the presence behind us, a looming shadow that seemed to close in with every step. Finally, the warning sign came into view, a beacon of safety at the edge of the forbidden trail. We burst past it, skidding to a halt on the main path, our chests heaving, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. We stood there, gasping for breath, our eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but the forest was still, the oppressive silence lifting as the sounds of birds and insects resumed their chorus. "What the hell was that?" Alex panted, his voice tinged with disbelief. I shook my head, trying to catch my breath, my mind still reeling from the encounter. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. We stood there for a few moments longer, our eyes locked on the entrance to the forbidden trail, half expecting whatever had chased us to emerge from the shadows. But the forest remained silent, the trail shrouded in mystery and darkness. As we made our way back to the trailhead, the adrenaline slowly ebbed, replaced by a sense of disbelief at what we had experienced. The forest, once a place of adventure and discovery, now felt like a place of secrets and danger. We didn't talk much on the way back, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the day in our minds. When we finally reached the safety of the parking lot, we exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of what we had been through. "Let's not do that again," Alex said, managing a weak smile. I nodded, grateful for the familiarity of the car, the sense of safety it provided. "Agreed, some trails are better left unexplored." As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the forest, wondering what secrets it held and what might be lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Whatever it was, it had left its mark on us, a reminder of the dangers that lay hidden in the heart of the wilderness. Story 6. I've captured countless images of nature's beauty over the years, but nothing could have prepared me for what my camera lens revealed that fateful day in the Blackwood Forest. What started as a routine wildlife photography expedition turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Alex Chen, and I'm a wildlife photographer. I've trekked through jungles, scaled mountains, and crawled through swamps to get the perfect shot. But it was in the familiar wilderness of my own backyard that I encountered something that defied explanation and left me questioning my sanity. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out for my week-long solo expedition in the Blackwood Forest. The trees were ablaze with red and gold, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I'd been to this forest dozens of times before, but something felt different this time. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I hiked deep into the forest, far from the well-trodden paths, to a small clearing where I'd set up my blind the previous day. It was the perfect spot, overlooking a stream where local wildlife often came to drink. As I settled in, adjusting my camera equipment, I felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. What wonders would nature reveal to me today? The hours ticked by slowly. I caught glimpses of the usual suspects: a family of deer, a curious raccoon, even a majestic bald eagle soaring overhead. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, something caught my eye. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing. I raised my camera, its powerful zoom lens bringing the tree line into sharp focus, and that's when I saw it. The figure was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in thick, matted fur. It moved with an odd grace, almost human-like, but not quite. My heart pounded in my chest as I clicked the shutter, capturing image after image of the creature. It was only when I lowered the camera that I realized the true strangeness of what I was seeing. The creature turned, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of its face. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, a bizarre mix of human and animal features that sent a chill down my spine. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest sound would alert the creature to my presence. It lingered at the edge of the clearing for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes before melting back into the shadows of the forest. With shaking hands, I reviewed the images on my camera's display. Each one showed the creature in stark detail, its muscular form, its strange, almost human-like hands, and that face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. As darkness fell, I made the decision to stay in my blind overnight. The thought of trekking back through the forest in the dark, with that thing out there, was too terrifying to contemplate. I settled in for a long, sleepless night, jumping at every sound, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond my little sanctuary. It was in those quiet hours, with only the sounds of the forest for company, that I began to hear them. Strange, guttural noises that didn't belong to any animal I knew. They echoed through the trees, sometimes close, sometimes far away, but always unsettling. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my blind, stiff and exhausted. The forest seemed different somehow, more menacing. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every rustle of leaves a possible threat. I made my way back to the small cabin I'd rented on the edge of the forest, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? Was it some undiscovered species, a hoax, or something more sinister? Once safely inside, I uploaded the photos to my laptop, eager to examine them more closely. But as the images appeared on the screen, my blood ran cold. In several of the shots, barely visible in the background, were more of the creatures. They blended so well with the forest that I hadn't noticed them at first, but now I could see them clearly, watching, waiting. I spent the next few days holed up in the cabin, alternating between poring over my photos and jumping at every sound outside. I knew I should leave, should report what I'd seen to someone, but a morbid curiosity kept me there. I needed to know more. On the third night, as a storm raged outside, I heard it, a heavy thud on the cabin's porch, then another and another. Something was out there, moving around the cabin. I cowered in the bedroom, my camera clutched to my chest like a lifeline as the sounds continued throughout the night. When morning came, I found large, muddy footprints circling the cabin, and there, stuck to the front door with what looked horribly like a claw, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. That was when I knew I had to leave. I threw my belongings into my car and sped away from the forest, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. But even as the trees receded in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Back in the city, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of hallucination, a product of too many nights alone in the wilderness. But the photos remained, undeniable proof of what I'd seen. I debated what to do with them. Part of me wanted to share them with the world, to prove that there were still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. But another part, a part that grew stronger with each passing day, wanted to delete them all and pretend it had never happened. In the end, I did neither. I stored the memory card in a safety deposit box, unable to look at the images again, but unwilling to destroy the only evidence of my encounter. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to return to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The world seemed bigger now, more mysterious, and infinitely more dangerous. I continued my work as a wildlife photographer, but I never returned to the Blackwood Forest. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about those creatures. Are they still out there, hidden away in the depths of the forest? And if they are, what else might be lurking in the wild places of the world, just beyond the reach of our understanding? I don't have answers to these questions, and part of me hopes I never will. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now I know that sometimes, when you point your camera into the dark looks back, and sometimes it follows you home. As I sit here, writing this account, I can't help but glance nervously at the window. The city lights twinkle in the distance, a comforting reminder of civilization. But beyond them, I know the wilderness waits. And in that wilderness, something watches and waits. So the next time you find yourself in the great outdoors, remember my story. And if you hear something moving in the underbrush, or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, don't dismiss it. Because the world is full of mysteries, and some of them have teeth. As for me, I'll keep taking pictures, keep exploring the beauty of nature. But I'll always be looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale rustle in the bushes, because once you've seen behind the veil, there's no going back. The wild isn't just a place anymore. It's a reminder that we're not alone, and that some secrets are better left undiscovered. Story 7. The forest at night was a place of shadows and whispers, where the line between reality and imagination blurred under the cloak of darkness. I'd always been drawn to its mysteries, the way the trees seemed to hold secrets in their gnarled branches, and the ground whispered stories with every crunch of leaves. As a wildlife photographer, the night offered a world unseen, a canvas painted in shades of black and silver, waiting to be captured through my lens. That night, I was ensconced in my makeshift hide, a small camouflage tent set up near a clearing known for its nocturnal visitors. I had spent countless nights like this, waiting in silence for the perfect shot, the thrill of the unknown keeping me alert and alive. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I settled in, adjusting my camera and checking the settings one last time. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the clearing, and I felt a familiar rush of anticipation. Tonight, I hoped to capture the elusive fox that had been spotted in the area, its fiery coat a striking contrast against the muted tones of the forest. The hours slipped by in a slow, steady rhythm, the forest alive with the soft hum of crickets and the distant call of an owl. I watched, waited, my senses attuned to the slightest movement, the faintest sound. The solitude was comforting, a reminder of why I loved this work, the way it connected me to the world in a way few other things could. But as the night deepened, a sense of unease began to creep in, subtle at first, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. The usual symphony of the forest seemed to falter, the silence growing heavier, more oppressive. I shook it off, attributing it to fatigue, the way the mind plays tricks when left alone in the dark for too long. I was about to shift my position when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart skipped a beat, a thrill of excitement coursing through me. I readied my camera, peering through the viewfinder, scanning the clearing for any sign of movement. But what I saw was not the sleek form of a fox or the graceful silhouette of a deer. Instead, two eyes stared back at me from the darkness, large and unblinking, reflecting the moonlight in an eerie, otherworldly glow. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and my excitement quickly turned to apprehension. I held my breath, my finger hovering over the shutter, torn between the instinct to capture the moment and the urge to flee. The eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if they were peering into my very soul, assessing, calculating. The seconds stretched into eternity, the air thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a steady drumbeat of fear and adrenaline. I forced myself to stay calm, to think rationally. It was probably just a trick of the light, I told myself, a reflection off a branch or a distant animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something out there, something watching me with an unsettling intensity. I slowly lowered my camera, the weight of the gaze pressing down on me like a physical force. The eyes blinked once, slowly, deliberately, and then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The forest was silent again, the oppressive stillness returning, and I was left with nothing but the echo of my own heartbeat in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and forced myself to think logically. Whatever it was, it hadn't made a move towards me. It was probably just curious, I reasoned, drawn by the scent of my camp or the faint glow of my equipment. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a constant prickling at the back of my neck, and I couldn't shake the sense of unease. I glanced at my watch, noting the time, and decided to pack up. I had enough shots for the night, and the prospect of staying any longer in the presence of whatever lurked in the shadows was less than appealing. I moved slowly, methodically, gathering my gear and dismantling the hide, my senses on high alert. Every rustle of the leaves, every creak of the branches seemed amplified, each sound a potential threat. I tried to focus on the task at hand, willing myself to stay calm, to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. As I finished packing, I cast one last look at the clearing, half expecting to see those eyes staring back at me. But the forest remained silent, the shadows deep and impenetrable, and I turned away, slinging my pack over my shoulder and heading back towards the trail. The walk back to my car was tense, every snap of a twig or whisper of the wind setting my nerves on edge. I kept my flashlight trained on the path, the beam cutting through the darkness, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over. When I finally reached the safety of my car, relief washed over me, mingled with a lingering sense of disbelief. I loaded my gear into the trunk, the familiar routine grounding me, and took a moment to collect my thoughts. As I drove away, the forest receding into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something extraordinary, something beyond the realm of the known. The memory of those eyes, watching me with an intensity that defied explanation, stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden in the heart of the wilderness. Back in the comfort of my home, I reviewed the photos I had taken, my fingers trembling slightly as I clicked through the images. The usual shots of deer and raccoons appeared, their eyes glowing softly in the flash, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest the presence of the watcher. But as I reached the end of the roll, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the corner of one frame, partially obscured by shadow, were those eyes, large, unblinking, and undeniably real. They stared out from the darkness, a silent testament to the encounter I had struggled to comprehend. I sat back, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. What had I seen? What had seen me? The questions lingered, unanswered, and I knew that the forest held its secrets close, revealing them only to those willing to venture into its depths. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of returning, of uncovering the truth behind the eyes in the night. The forest was a place of shadows and whispers, a world of mystery and wonder, and I was drawn to it, compelled by the desire to understand, to capture the unseen. And so, with the memory of those eyes etched into my mind, I prepared for my next adventure, ready to face whatever lay beyond the edge of the light. Story 8. I've been a hunter all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Whispering Pines forest. What started as a routine hunting trip turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist, something that turned us from predators into prey. My name is John Hawkins, and I've been hunting these woods since I was old enough to hold a rifle. I know every trail, every creek, and every clearing like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. It was the first weekend of deer season, and I'd convinced my buddies, Mike and Tom, to join me for a 3-day hunting trip. We'd been planning this excursion for months, eagerly anticipating the crisp autumn air and the thrill of the hunt. We arrived at our usual campsite just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the ancient pines. As we set up our tents and prepared dinner over the campfire, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was off. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds conspicuously absent. "You guys notice how quiet it is?" I asked, glancing around the darkening woods. Mike nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, it's weird. Maybe a storm's coming." We shrugged it off and turned in early, eager to get an early start the next morning. But sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, plagued by unsettling dreams of being chased through endless dark woods by something I couldn't quite see. I woke before dawn, the remnants of my nightmares clinging to me like cobwebs. As I emerged from my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Our cooler, which we'd secured in the bed of my pickup truck, had been torn apart. Its contents were strewn across the campsite, and deep claw marks scored the plastic. "What the hell?" Tom exclaimed, examining the destroyed cooler. "Bear!" I shook my head, my mouth dry. "No bear I've ever seen could do this. Look at those claw marks." We spent the next hour securing our campsite, all thoughts of hunting temporarily forgotten. Whatever had done this was still out there, and we needed to be prepared. As the sun finally crested the horizon, we set out, rifles at the ready. The morning mist clung to the forest floor, giving everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. We moved silently through the trees, our senses on high alert. It was near midday when we found it, a deer carcass, or what was left of it. The poor animal had been torn apart, its flesh rent by savage claws and teeth, but it wasn't the violence of the kill that disturbed me most. It was the precision. This wasn't the messy feeding of a bear or mountain lion. The carcass had been systematically dismembered, almost intelligently. "Jesus," Mike whispered, his face pale. "What could have done this?" Before I could answer, a twig snapped somewhere behind us. We spun around, rifles raised, but saw nothing but trees and mist. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Back to camp," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now." We moved quickly but cautiously, constantly scanning our surroundings. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was overwhelming. Twice more we heard that bone-chilling growl, each time closer than the last. We were within sight of our campsite when it happened. Tom, who was bringing up the rear, let out a strangled cry. I turned just in time to see him yanked off his feet by something massive and dark that disappeared into the underbrush as quickly as it had appeared. "Tom!" Mike yelled, raising his rifle. "No!" I grabbed his arm. "You might hit Tom. We need to track them." Pushing aside our fear, we plunged into the forest after our friend. We followed a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth, the sounds of a struggle growing louder. Then, suddenly, silence. We emerged into a small clearing and froze. There, in the center, stood the creature. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, with arms that hung almost to the ground. But it was the face that struck true terror into my heart. It was almost human, but twisted, feral, with eyes that gleamed with terrifying intelligence. At its feet lay Tom, unconscious, but alive. The creature looked at us, then at Tom, as if deciding which prey to pursue. In that moment of indecision, I acted. I raised my rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and the creature roared in pain and anger. It turned and fled into the trees with inhuman speed, leaving us alone with our injured friend. We wasted no time. Hoisting Tom between us, we made our way back to camp as fast as we could. The sun was setting by the time we reached my truck, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us with grasping fingers. As we loaded Tom into the back seat, a chorus of howls erupted from the darkening forest. They were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite wolf, not quite human, but something in between, and they were coming from all around us. We peeled out of there, gravel spraying as I gunned the engine. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of dark shapes emerging from the tree line, their eyes reflecting the glow of my taillights. The drive back to civilization was a blur of adrenaline and fear. We took Tom straight to the hospital, where he was treated for deep lacerations and a concussion. When he finally regained consciousness, his story matched ours, an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We reported our experience to the local authorities, but they were skeptical, to say the least. They talked about bear attacks and mountain lions, about how fear can play tricks on the mind, but I knew what we'd seen. We all did. I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I pored over cryptozoology websites, read every book I could find on unexplained creatures. I even tried to go back to Whispering Pines, but I couldn't bring myself to step foot in those woods again. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I find myself thinking about that creature, about the intelligence in its eyes, the almost human quality of its movements. And I wonder, what if it wasn't alone? What if there are more of them out there, hiding in the dark corners of the wilderness? I still hunt, but never alone. and never in whispering pines. The thrill of the chase has been replaced by a constant wariness, a heightened awareness of the shadows around me, because now I know that sometimes the hunter can become the hunted. To this day, I'm not sure what we encountered in those woods. Some undiscovered species, a creature of legend come to life, or something else entirely. I don't have the answers, and part of me hopes I never will. But I do know this: the wilderness is vast, and we understand so little of it. There are things out there hiding in the shadows that defy explanation, things that challenge everything we think we know about the natural world. So the next time you're in the woods and you hear a twig snap behind you or catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of your vision, remember my story. Remember that there are predators out there far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion, and sometimes, just sometimes, they're hunting us. As for me, I'll keep hunting, keep exploring the wilderness I love. But I'll always be looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale growl, because once you've seen behind the veil of the ordinary world, there's no going back. The forest isn't just a place anymore. It's a reminder that we're not alone, and that some mysteries are better left unsolved. But if you do venture into the deep woods, keep your wits about you. And if you hear those howls in the night, run, and don't look back. Because in the primal dance of predator and prey, you never know when the tables might turn. Story 9. There's a certain allure to the untamed wilderness, a pull that draws me to the depths of the forest where the world feels raw and untouched. The ancient trees stand like silent sentinels, their branches weaving a canopy that filters the sunlight into a mosaic of light and shadow. It's a place where time seems to stand still, where the air is thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds are the whispers of the wind and the calls of distant birds. But on that particular day, as I ventured deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My name is Mark, and I've always been an avid hiker, seeking solace in the solitude of nature. The forest was my refuge, a place where I could escape the chaos of everyday life and find peace in the simplicity of the natural world. I had planned this hike for weeks, eager to explore a remote trail that wound through a section of the forest rarely visited by others. The trailhead was unmarked, a narrow path that disappeared into the underbrush, and I felt a thrill of anticipation as I set out. The air was cool and crisp, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I walked with a steady pace, my boots crunching softly on the leaf-strewn ground, my senses attuned to the rhythm of the forest. As I ventured further, the trail became less distinct, the trees closing in around me, their branches forming a dense, tangled web overhead. The sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a woodpecker. It was a world untouched by time, a sanctuary of wild beauty that filled me with a sense of wonder. But as I continued, a new sound reached my ears, faint at first, barely discernible over the natural symphony of the forest. It was the sound of footsteps echoing my own, as if someone or something was following me. I paused, listening intently, but the forest fell silent. The only sound, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my imagination, the way the mind can play tricks when left alone in the wilderness. But as I resumed my hike, the footsteps returned, keeping pace with me, always just a few steps behind. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a growing sense of unease, the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped again, turning to scan the woods behind me, but there was nothing. Just the trees standing silent and still, their shadows stretching long and dark across the forest floor. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and continued on, determined to reach the end of the trail. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing taller and more imposing, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decay, and I felt a sense of isolation, as if I had stepped into another world. The footsteps persisted, a constant presence at the edge of my awareness, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, my nerves on edge. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, an almost tangible weight pressing down on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, hidden among the trees. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flitting between the trees, too quick to be anything natural. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, and scanned the woods, but there was nothing, just the play of light and shadow on the leaves. I shook my head, trying to dispel the fear that had taken hold, and pressed on, my pace quickening as I neared the end of the trail. The footsteps seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Finally, the trail opened up into a small clearing, a patch of sunlight breaking through the canopy to illuminate the forest floor. I paused, catching my breath, and listened. The footsteps had stopped, the forest falling silent once more, and I felt a momentary sense of relief, but as I stood there, the silence was shattered by a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. It was a sound that spoke of danger, of something wild and untamed lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I turned, my eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. The growl came again, closer this time, and I felt a surge of adrenaline, my instincts screaming at me to run. I took a step back, my heart racing, and stumbled over a root, falling to the ground. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive, and I struggled to my feet, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had to get out of there, had to find my way back to the safety of the main trail. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the earth, the branches whipping at my face as I pushed through the underbrush. The growl echoed behind me, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows, and I felt a surge of panic, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the trees blurring into a dizzying maze of green and brown, and I fought to keep my bearings, to find my way back to the safety of the trailhead. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline, every instinct focused on escape. Finally, I burst out onto the main path, the familiar sight of the trailhead a welcome relief. I stumbled to a halt, my chest heaving, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I glanced back at the forest, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But the woods remained silent, the oppressive stillness lifting as the sounds of birds and insects resumed their chorus. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and made my way back to my car, the sense of relief mingled with a lingering sense of unease. The forest, once a place of solace and beauty, now felt like a place of secrets and danger, a reminder of the unknown that lay hidden in the heart of the wilderness. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something extraordinary, something beyond the realm of the known. The memory of the footsteps, the growl that echoed through the trees, stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lay waiting in the depths of the forest. Back in the safety of my home, I replayed the events of the day in my mind, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. The forest was a place of shadows and whispers, a world of mystery and wonder, and I was drawn to it, compelled by the desire to understand, to uncover the truth behind the echoes in the night. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I knew I would return, ready to face whatever lay beyond the edge of the light, eager to explore the untamed wilderness and the secrets it held. Story 10. I've always loved the thrill of adventure, but nothing could have prepared me for the terror that awaited us in the depths of Shadow Mountain. What began as an exciting hiking trip turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the world around us. My name is Emma Reeves, and I'm an experienced hiker and outdoor enthusiast. I've tackled some of the most challenging trails across the country, but it was on a seemingly routine expedition that I encountered something that defied explanation and left me questioning my sanity. It was supposed to be a 3-day hike through the rugged terrain of Shadow Mountain with my best friends, Sarah and Mark. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to explore the lesser-known trails and test our skills against the unpredictable mountain weather. The first day of our hike was picture perfect. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the views were breathtaking. We made good time, covering more ground than we'd anticipated. As we set up camp that evening, there was a palpable sense of excitement about what the next day would bring. But as night fell, the weather took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds rolled in, obscuring the stars, and a biting wind picked up, whistling through the trees. We huddled around our campfire, trying to stay warm and maintain our spirits. "Maybe we should head back tomorrow," Sarah suggested, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Mark shook his head. "We've come this far. A little bad weather isn't going to stop us, right, Emma?" I nodded, though a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me we should listen to Sarah. If only I had heeded that instinct. We woke the next morning to a world transformed. A thick blanket of snow covered the ground, and heavy flakes continued to fall, obscuring our vision and making the trail treacherous. But we were determined to push on, confident in our abilities and our equipment. As we trudged through the deepening snow, the wind howled around us, driving the icy flakes into our faces. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and I began to worry that we'd strayed from the trail. But turning back seemed just as dangerous as pressing forward. It was Mark who spotted the cave entrance, a dark slash in the white landscape. "Look!" he shouted over the wind. "We can wait out the storm in there." Grateful for any respite from the relentless blizzard, we made our way towards the cave. As we drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. The entrance was oddly symmetrical, almost as if it had been carved rather than formed naturally. But with the storm raging around us, I pushed my concerns aside. The interior of the cave was surprisingly spacious, stretching back farther than our flashlights could penetrate. The walls were smooth, almost polished, with strange markings etched into the stone. As we moved deeper into the cave, seeking shelter from the howling wind, I ran my hand along one of the walls, tracing the unfamiliar symbols with my fingers. "What do you think these mean?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. Sarah shrugged, her expression uneasy. "I don't know, but they give me the creeps. Maybe we shouldn't go too far in." But Mark was already striding ahead, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. "Come on, guys. Where's your sense of adventure?" Reluctantly, we followed him deeper into the cave. The passage twisted and turned, leading us ever downward. The air grew colder, and a musty animal scent filled our nostrils. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the very rock around us. We froze, our flashlights darting nervously around the cavern. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. Before anyone could answer, a gust of wind extinguished our flashlights, plunging us into total darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled to relight them, the strange rumbling growing louder. When we finally got our lights working again, what we saw made my blood run cold. The walls of the cave were moving. What I had taken for strange markings were actually claw marks, hundreds of them, crisscrossing the stone in a frenzied pattern. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now!" But as we turned to retrace our steps, we realized with growing horror that the passage behind us had changed. Where there had been a clear path, there was now only solid rock. We were trapped. The rumbling grew louder, and with it came a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my days, a mix of growls, snuffles, and something that sounded disturbingly like human speech. And it was coming from deeper within the cave. With no other choice, we pressed onward, our hearts pounding in our chests. The passage widened into a vast chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. And there, in the center of the room, was something that defied explanation. It was massive, easily twice the size of a grizzly bear, with thick, matted fur covering its body. But it wasn't a bear. Its limbs were too long, too human-like, and its face, when it turned toward us, was a nightmarish blend of animal and man. For a moment, we all stood frozen, locked in a staring contest with this impossible creature. Then, as if a spell had been broken, we ran. We ran harder and faster than I thought possible, our screams echoing off the cave walls. I could hear it behind us, its heavy breathing and the scrape of claws on stone spurring us on. We twisted and turned through the labyrinthine passages, not knowing where we were going, only that we had to get away. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we saw it, a faint glimmer of daylight ahead. With a final burst of speed, we burst out of the cave and into the blinding whiteness of the snowstorm. We didn't stop running until we could no longer see the cave entrance. Only then did we collapse into the snow, gasping for breath, our minds reeling from what we'd experienced. The storm had eased somewhat, and in the distance we could see the lights of the ranger station we'd passed on our way up the mountain. On shaking legs, we made our way towards safety, constantly looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that monstrous shape emerging from the snow. When we finally reached the ranger station, we were hypothermic and in shock. We tried to tell the rangers what we'd seen, but our story was met with skepticism and concern for our mental state. They chalked our experience up to hallucinations brought on by fear and exposure. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of shared delusion, but the nightmares persisted, vivid and terrifying. And when I looked in the mirror, I could see the faint scars on my back where something had clawed at me as we fled. I became obsessed with finding an explanation for what we'd encountered. I pored over local legends, studied geological surveys of the area, and even tried to organize an expedition back to Shadow Mountain. But every time I got close to the trailhead, that primal fear would grip me, and I'd turn back. Sarah and Mark refused to speak about what happened, preferring to pretend it had never occurred. But I couldn't let it go. I knew what we'd seen was real, no matter how impossible it seemed. Years have passed, and I still haven't found the answers I'm looking for. But I've come to accept that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark places where humans rarely tread. I still hike, still love the outdoors. But I'm more cautious now, more aware of the shadows around me, and I never ever enter a cave without knowing exactly where it leads. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you come across a cave or a dark hollow in the earth, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real, and sometimes they're waiting just beyond the reach of our flashlights, in the deep, dark places of the world. As for me, I'll keep searching for answers, keep trying to understand what we encountered in that cave, but part of me hopes I never find out, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened, and sometimes the greatest danger lies not in what we can see, but in what lurks just beyond the edge of our understanding, waiting in the darkness. Story 11. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest like a forgotten relic, its weathered wood and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. We stumbled upon it by accident, our group of friends drawn to its mysterious presence as we explored the dense woods on our weekend camping trip. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that stretched across the clearing, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. We were miles from the nearest town, and the idea of spending the night in the cabin seemed like an adventure too good to pass up. There were 4 of us, me, Emily, Jake, and Mia, friends since college, united by our love of the outdoors and the thrill of exploring the unknown. The day had been spent hiking and laughing, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves underfoot. But as we approached the cabin, a heavy silence seemed to settle over the clearing, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, revealing a dim interior filled with dust and cobwebs. The cabin was small, just a single room with a stone fireplace and a few pieces of dilapidated furniture. It smelled of mildew and decay, but there was something oddly inviting about it, a sense of history and secrets hidden within its walls. "We should stay here tonight," Jake suggested, his voice echoing in the empty space. "It's better than setting up the tents in the dark." Emily and Mia exchanged a glance, a mixture of excitement and apprehension in their eyes. I nodded, feeling a thrill of anticipation at the thought of spending the night in such a place. We set about unpacking our gear, spreading sleeping bags on the floor and lighting a small fire in the hearth to chase away the chill. As the flames flickered, casting a warm glow over the room, we settled in, sharing stories and passing around a flask of whiskey to ward off the cold. The cabin felt cozy, almost safe, and the sounds of the forest outside faded into the background, replaced by the crackling of the fire and the murmur of our voices. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. It started with the sound of scratching at the walls, faint at first, like the rustle of branches against the wood. We dismissed it as the wind, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. "What is that?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. Jake shrugged, trying to sound unconcerned, probably just a raccoon or something. But as the scratching continued, a sense of unease settled over us, the warmth of the fire unable to dispel the chill that crept into the room. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a constant prickling at the back of my neck. We decided to turn in, hoping that sleep would come and chase away the strange atmosphere that had settled over the cabin. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the shadowed ceiling, listening to the sounds of my friends breathing softly around me. But the scratching persisted, a relentless reminder that we were not alone. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to a loud thud, the sound reverberating through the cabin like a gunshot. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw that the others were awake too, their eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the dying fire. We nodded, exchanging nervous glances as we listened intently, the silence oppressive and suffocating. The scratching had stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy moving outside, the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs echoing in the night. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get out of the cabin and back to the safety of the woods. But we were miles from anywhere, and the thought of venturing into the darkness was even more terrifying. Jake grabbed the flashlight, his hands trembling as he switched it on. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice shaky but determined. We watched as he moved to the window, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. I held my breath, my heart racing as I waited for him to say something, anything, to break the tension that hung in the air, but all he said was, "I don't see anything." Relief washed over me, mingled with a lingering sense of unease. We settled back down, trying to convince ourselves that it was just an animal, that there was nothing to fear. But sleep was elusive, chased away by the knowledge that something was out there, lurking in the shadows. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-sleep and whispered fears, the darkness pressing in around us like a living thing. When dawn finally broke, the first light of day filtering through the cracks in the walls, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed by the events of the night. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the cabin and the strange atmosphere that clung to it like a shroud. As we stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes tracked our every move as we made our way back to the trail. The forest was silent, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that set my teeth on edge. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I quickened my pace, eager to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I glanced back one last time. half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows, but the cabin stood silent and empty, its secrets hidden within its walls, and I turned away, determined to forget the events of the night. But as we made our way back to civilization, the memory of the scratching, the thud in the night, stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden in the heart of the wilderness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something extraordinary, something beyond the realm of the known. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of returning, of uncovering the truth behind the cabin and the strange presence that haunted it. The forest was a place of shadows and whispers, a world of mystery and wonder, and I was drawn to it, compelled by the desire to understand, to capture the unseen. And so, with the memory of the cabin etched into my mind, I prepared for my next adventure, ready to face whatever lay beyond the edge of the light. Story 12. I've been fishing these waters for over 30 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that day on Whisper Lake. What started as a peaceful fishing trip turned into a nightmare that still sends shivers down my spine and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Frank Thompson, and I've been a local fishing guide in these parts since I was old enough to hold a rod. I know every inlet, every hidden cove, and every sweet spot where the big ones like to hide, or at least I thought I did. It was a crisp autumn morning when I took out a group of city folks for a day of fishing on Whisper Lake. The group consisted of a father and son duo, Tom and Jimmy, and a couple, Sarah and Mike. They were all eager to experience the tranquility of the lake and maybe catch their dinner. As we set out in my trusty old boat, the mist was still rising off the water, giving the lake an almost otherworldly appearance. The trees along the shoreline were a riot of reds and golds, their colors reflected perfectly in the glass-like surface of the water. "It's so quiet out here," Sarah remarked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, a small smile playing on my lips. "That's why they call it Whisper Lake. Legend has it that if you listen closely, you can hear the spirits of the forest whispering their secrets." Mike chuckled nervously. "Let's hope the only spirits we encounter today are in the cooler." We spent the morning fishing in some of my favorite spots, with moderate success. Jimmy was thrilled when he caught his first bass, and even Tom managed to land a decent-sized trout. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lake seemed unusually still, even for Whisper Lake. There were no birds calling from the shore, no insects buzzing over the water. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was near midday when we decided to try our luck in a secluded cove on the far side of the lake. As we approached, I noticed something strange in the water ahead of us. At first, I thought it was just a piece of driftwood, but as we drew closer, I realized it was moving. "What's that?" Jimmy asked, pointing at the shape in the water. Before I could answer, the thing in the water moved again, and this time I got a clear look at it. It was huge, easily twice the size of my boat, with a long serpentine neck that rose out of the water. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. It looked like something out of a prehistoric documentary, not something that should be in a lake in the middle of nowhere. "Holy shit," Tom breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. The creature turned its head towards us, and I felt my blood run cold. Its eyes were intelligent, almost human-like, and filled with a primal hunger that made my skin crawl. "Everyone stay calm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I slowly began to turn the boat around. "We're going to head back to shore, nice and easy." But the creature had other ideas. With a speed that belied its massive size, it began to move towards us, creating waves that rocked our small boat dangerously. "Go! Go! Go!" Mike yelled, and I didn't need to be told twice. I gunned the engine, steering us towards the nearest shore as fast as the old boat could manage. I could hear the thing behind us, the splash of its movement in the water growing closer with each passing second. Sarah was crying, clutching Mike's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Jimmy had buried his face in his father's chest, while Tom stared back at the creature with a mix of terror and awe. We were almost to the shore when the creature made its move. It dove under the water, and for a moment I thought we'd lost it. Then the boat lurched violently as something massive struck it from below. "Hold on!" I yelled as we were nearly capsized. Water sloshed over the sides of the boat, soaking us and our gear. The next few minutes were a blur of terror and adrenaline. I managed to keep the boat upright and moving forward, even as the creature continued to harass us from below. Finally, with a sickening crunch, we ran aground on the rocky shore. "Everybody out!" I shouted, and we all scrambled onto land, not stopping until we were well away from the water's edge. From the safety of the shore, we watched in horrified fascination as the creature surfaced once more. It regarded us with those unnervingly intelligent eyes for a long moment before slowly sinking back into the depths of the lake. We stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what we'd just experienced. My mind raced with questions. What was that thing? How could it exist in a lake this size without anyone knowing? And most importantly, what else might be out there that we don't know about? It took us hours to work up the courage to get back in the boat and make our way back to the dock. We were all in shock, barely speaking as we loaded up our gear and prepared to leave. As we were about to depart, Tom pulled me aside. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll think we're crazy. Or worse, they'll come looking for it." Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that we needed to report what we'd seen. But another part, a part that grew stronger with each passing moment, knew he was right. Who would believe us? And if they did, what would happen to the lake, to the creature? In the days and weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd encountered. I pored over books on local legends and cryptozoology, searching for any mention of a creature like the one we'd seen. I even went back to Whisper Lake several times, hoping to catch another glimpse of the beast. But the lake remained stubbornly still and silent, as if nothing had ever disturbed its tranquil surface. My reputation as a guide suffered. I couldn't bring myself to take people out on the lake anymore, not knowing what lurked beneath the surface. Some folks thought I'd gone soft, others that I'd lost my nerve. But how could I explain the real reason without sounding like a madman? Years have passed since that day, and I still don't have any answers. But I've come to accept that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist on the fringes of our understanding. I still fish, still love the water, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the mysteries that might be hiding just beneath the surface. And I never, ever underestimate the power and secrets of nature. So the next time you're out on a lake and you see a ripple in the water that doesn't quite fit, or hear a splash that sounds a little too big, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the old legends have a grain of truth to them. And sometimes the most incredible discoveries are made when we least expect them. As for me, I'll keep watching Whisper Lake, keep hoping for another glimpse of the impossible, because once you've seen behind the veil of the ordinary world, there's no going back. The lake isn't just a body of water anymore. It's a reminder that the world is vast and mysterious, and that some secrets are meant to stay hidden beneath the surface. But if you do venture out onto those quiet waters, keep your wits about you, and if you hear a whisper on the wind or see a shadow move beneath your boat, don't dismiss it. Because in the depths of Whisper Lake, and perhaps in waters all around the world, there are wonders and terrors beyond our wildest imaginations, waiting to be discovered. Story 13. The forest was a tapestry of shadows and whispers, a place where the line between reality and myth blurred beneath the dense canopy of trees. I had spent countless days and nights in these woods, tracking deer and elk with the precision of a seasoned hunter. But that morning, as I followed a set of unfamiliar tracks, I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with a tinge of unease. The prints were large and deep, unlike anything I had ever seen, and they led into the heart of the forest where the light barely penetrated. My name is Tom, and I've been hunting these woods for over 20 years. I know every trail, every hidden clearing, every sound the forest makes. But as I crouched beside the tracks, examining the impressions in the soft earth, I felt a shiver of excitement. The tracks were fresh, the edges sharp and defined, and they spoke of a creature of considerable size and weight. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear, perhaps, or an elk larger than any I had encountered before. I set off along the trail, my senses attuned to the rhythm of the forest. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I moved with the practiced stealth of a hunter, my rifle slung over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the path ahead. The tracks led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew taller and the underbrush thicker. The usual symphony of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I felt a growing sense of unease, the feeling that I was not alone, that unseen eyes were watching my every move. I paused, listening intently, but the forest remained silent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I shook off the feeling, attributing it to the isolation and the thrill of the hunt. But as I continued, the sense of being watched persisted, a constant prickling at the back of my neck. The trail wound through a dense thicket, the branches clawing at my clothes as I pushed through. I emerged into a small clearing, where the tracks suddenly disappeared, as if the creature had taken flight. I frowned, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance, but the earth was undisturbed, the leaves unbroken. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, the silence of the forest pressing in around me. The clearing felt different, charged with an energy that set my nerves on edge. I had the distinct impression that I was not alone, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. A low growl echoed through the trees, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was deep and guttural, unlike anything I had heard before, and it seemed to reverberate through the very air. I swung my rifle around, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, the shadows deep and impenetrable. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get out of the clearing and back to the safety of the known trails. But the hunter in me was curious, driven by the need to understand, to see what lay beyond the veil of shadows. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing. The growl came again, closer this time, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. My heart raced, my senses heightened, every instinct focused on survival. The underbrush rustled, and I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of fur, a shadow darting between the trees. I raised my rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger, my mind racing with possibilities. But the figure disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the forest. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The growl had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained, a constant presence at the edge of my awareness. I knew I had to leave, to get back to the safety of the main trail. I turned and retraced my steps, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of fear and curiosity. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I could feel the presence behind me, a shadow that followed my every move, and I quickened my pace, eager to put distance between myself and whatever lurked in the woods. When I finally emerged onto the main trail, relief washed over me, mingled with a lingering sense of unease. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, the oppressive silence lifting as I moved away from the clearing. But the memory of the growl, the shadow that had watched me from the trees, stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lay hidden in the heart of the wilderness. Back at the cabin, I recounted my experience to the other hunters, but they dismissed it as a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was out there, something beyond the realm of the known. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of returning, of uncovering the truth behind the tracks and the shadow in the woods. The forest was a place of shadows and whispers, a world of mystery and wonder, and I was drawn to it, compelled by the desire to understand, to capture the unseen. And so, with the memory of the growl etched into my mind, I prepared for my next adventure, ready to face whatever lay beyond the edge of the light. Story 14. I've been the keeper of the Craggy Point Lighthouse for 30 years, but nothing in all those lonely nights could have prepared me for the terror that stalked me through the fog. What began as another solitary winter turned into a battle for my sanity and my life. My name is Samuel Hawkins, and I've spent most of my adult life tending to the beacon that guides ships safely past the treacherous rocks of Craggy Point. It's a solitary existence, especially during the long winter months when storms lash the coast and visitors are few and far between. But I've always found peace in the rhythm of the waves and the steady pulse of the lighthouse beam. That all changed on a grey November morning. I was making my usual rounds, checking the equipment and scanning the misty horizon for any signs of approaching vessels. That's when I saw them. A set of footprints in the wet sand, leading up from the water's edge. At first, I thought nothing of it. Perhaps a hiker had wandered down from the cliffs, though it had been weeks since I'd seen another soul. But as I drew closer, my blood ran cold. These weren't human footprints. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own feet, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. I followed the tracks with my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. They led straight up to the lighthouse, circled the base once, and then disappeared. It was as if whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me, I retreated to the safety of the lighthouse, but as I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as the wind howled and rain lashed against the windows, I heard it for the first time, a deep, rumbling breath that seemed to come from just outside the lighthouse walls. I told myself it was just the storm, just my imagination running wild after years of solitude, but deep down I knew better. The next morning I found more tracks in the mud around the base of the lighthouse, and there, stuck to the heavy wooden door, was a tuft of coarse, dark hair. My hands shook as I examined it. It wasn't like any animal fur I'd ever seen before. It was thicker, almost human-like, but with a wild, musky scent that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, jumping at every creak of the old lighthouse and every gust of wind. As night fell, I found myself huddled in the lantern room, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the glass. That's when I saw it, a massive shape moving through the mist, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could see the gleam of eyes reflecting the lighthouse beam, eyes that were fixed directly on me. I scrambled for the radio, desperate to call for help. But as soon as I turned it on, all I got was static. Whatever was out there, it was interfering with the signal. The next few days passed in a blur of terror and sleepless nights. The creature, for I was now certain it was a creature of some kind, seemed to be toying with me. It would leave signs of its presence, more tracks, tufts of hair, deep scratches in the lighthouse door, but always stayed just out of sight. I began to hear its breathing at night, growing closer and closer. Objects in the lighthouse would be moved while I slept, and more than once I woke to find muddy footprints leading right up to my bedroom door. On the 5th night, as a particularly violent storm raged outside, I heard a sound that chilled me to my very core, the scrape of claws on the metal rungs of the lighthouse ladder. It was inside. In a panic, I barricaded myself in the lantern room, pushing every piece of furniture I could find against the door. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed up the spiral staircase, growing louder with each passing second. Then silence. For a long moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart, and then a scratch at the door. Another. The wood began to splinter under the force of whatever was trying to get in. In that moment, staring at the slowly disintegrating door, I made a decision. If this was to be my last night on Earth, I would face it head-on. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the toolbox and stood ready, my whole body trembling with fear and adrenaline. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and there it stood, a creature out of nightmare. It was massive, covered in thick, matted fur, with a face that was a terrifying blend of human and beast. But it was the eyes that truly struck terror into my heart. They were intelligent, almost human-like, filled with a primal hunger that made my blood run cold. For a moment we stood frozen, locked in a staring contest that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then, as if a spell had been broken, it lunged for me. I swung the wrench with all my might, connecting solidly with its head. The creature stumbled back, more surprised than hurt, and I seized my chance. I dove past it, tumbling down the spiral staircase in my haste to escape. I could hear it behind me, its roars of rage echoing off the lighthouse walls. I ran out into the storm, the rain lashing my face as I made for the cliffs. I knew these rocks like the back of my hand, having walked them every day for 30 years. It was my only advantage. I scrambled over slippery boulders and through narrow crevices, the creature's heavy footfalls growing ever closer. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I saw it, a narrow cave entrance, barely visible in the gloom. I threw myself into the opening, squeezing through a gap too small for the massive creature to follow. I could hear it outside, roaring in frustration, its claws scrabbling at the rock face. I don't know how long I stayed in that cave, shivering and terrified. Hours passed, maybe days. The storm raged on outside, but eventually the sounds of the creature faded away. When I finally worked up the courage to emerge, weak with hunger and exhaustion, the world seemed unchanged. The lighthouse stood as it always had, its beam sweeping across the turbulent waters. There was no sign of the creature, no evidence of the terror I had endured. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of hallucination, a product of too many years of solitude. But the scratches on the lighthouse door remained, and sometimes, on quiet nights, I could swear I heard that deep, rumbling breath on the wind. I stayed on as lighthouse keeper for another year, unable to leave my post, but also unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every unexplained sound, every shadow at the edge of my vision sent my heart racing. In the end, it was too much. I retired, moved back to the mainland, tried to put it all behind me, but the memories lingered and the questions remained. What was that creature? Where did it come from? And most importantly, was it still out there waiting in the mist? Years have passed, and I've never found answers to those questions. But I've come to accept that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist on the fringes of our understanding. I still love the sea, still feel drawn to its mysteries, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the shadows that lurk at the edges of our world. And I never, ever underestimate the power of the unknown. So the next time you're standing at the edge of the ocean, watching the waves crash against a lonely lighthouse, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the old sea legends have a grain of truth to them. And sometimes the most terrifying discoveries are made in the places we thought we knew best. As for me, I'll keep watching the horizon, keep listening for that rumbling breath on the wind. Because once you've glimpsed what lies beyond the veil of the ordinary world, there's no going back. The sea isn't just water anymore. It's a reminder that our world is vast and mysterious, and that some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the depths. But if you find yourself alone on a foggy shore, keep your wits about you. And if you hear a sound that doesn't quite fit, or see a shadow move where no shadow should be, don't dismiss it. Because at the edge of the world, where the land meets the sea, there are wonders and terrors beyond our wildest imaginations, waiting to be discovered. Story 15. The storm rolled in faster than we anticipated, dark clouds swallowing the sky and turning day into night. We were miles from our campsite, caught in the open with nowhere to go but forward. The rain fell in sheets, drenching us to the bone, and the wind howled through the trees like a living thing. That's when we saw it, a dark opening in the rock face, a cave that promised shelter from the tempest raging around us. I'm Alex, and I was out on a weekend hike with my best friend, Sam. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, eager to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the tranquility of nature. The morning had been perfect, with clear skies and a gentle breeze guiding us along the mountain trail. But by afternoon, the weather had turned, and we found ourselves racing against the storm, hoping to find refuge before the worst of it hit. "Over here!" Sam shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. He pointed towards the cave, a dark maw in the side of the mountain, half hidden by the underbrush. We scrambled up the rocky slope, slipping and sliding on the wet ground, and ducked inside just as the storm reached its peak. The cave was deeper than it appeared, stretching back into the mountain in a series of twisting tunnels. We shook off the rain, grateful for the shelter, and set our packs down on the dry stone floor. The air inside was cool and musty, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sharp that I couldn't quite place. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing jagged walls and a ceiling that arched high above us. "This is perfect," Sam said, his breath visible in the chilly air. "We'll wait out the storm here and head back once it clears." I nodded, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my stomach. The cave felt different, charged with an energy that set my nerves on edge. But the rain was relentless, and the thought of heading back out into the storm was even more unappealing. We explored the cave a bit, our footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The tunnels twisted and turned, branching off into narrow passageways that disappeared into the darkness. It was easy to get turned around, and I made a mental note to stay close to the entrance, where the faint light of the storm filtered in. As we settled in to wait, the storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a banshee and the rain pounding against the rocks. We sat in silence, the only sound the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The cave was a world unto itself, a place untouched by time, and I felt a strange sense of isolation, as if we were the only two people left in the world. But as the minutes turned to hours, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. It started with the sound of footsteps, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. I dismissed it as the echo of our own movements, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Do you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Sam looked up, his brow furrowed. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," I said, my voice barely a whisper, like someone's walking around back there. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's probably just the wind. This place is full of echoes." I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a constant prickling at the back of my neck. I scanned the darkness, my flashlight beam dancing over the walls, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. We tried to distract ourselves with conversation, talking about anything and everything to pass the time. But the atmosphere had shifted, and the cave felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. The shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of the light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the cave, followed by the unmistakable sound of rocks tumbling to the ground. We jumped to our feet, the noise reverberating through the tunnels like a gunshot. "What was that?" Sam asked, his voice tight with tension. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know. It came from further in." We hesitated, torn between the safety of the entrance and the need to investigate. The noise had been loud, too loud to ignore, and I felt a growing sense of dread at what we might find. "Stay close," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. We moved cautiously, our flashlights illuminating the way as we ventured deeper into the cave. The air grew colder and the metallic scent intensified, mingling with the earthy smell of damp stone. The tunnels twisted and turned, and I struggled to keep track of our path, marking the walls with chalk as we went. As we rounded a bend, the beam of my flashlight caught something on the ground. An old, rusted lantern, its glass cracked and covered in dust. I knelt down, examining it closely, and felt a chill run down my spine. It was ancient, a relic from another time, and I couldn't help but wonder who had left it behind. "Look at this," I said, holding it up for Sam to see. He frowned, taking it from me. "Do you think someone else was here?" I shrugged, my mind racing. "Maybe, but it looks like it's been here for years." We pressed on, the sense of unease growing with each step. The cave seemed to close in around us, the walls pressing in like a living thing. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence was oppressive, a heavy weight that settled over us like a shroud. Finally, we reached a large chamber, the ceiling lost in shadows high above. In the center of the room was a pile of rocks, freshly fallen from the wall. I felt a surge of relief, mixed with confusion. The noise we'd heard had been nothing more than a rock slide, a natural occurrence in a place like this. But as we turned to leave, something caught my eye, a glint of metal half buried in the rubble. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt, and uncovered an old, rusted knife, its blade dull and pitted with age. I held it up, my mind racing with questions. Who had left it here and why? The cave was a place of secrets, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something we weren't meant to see. "We should go," Sam said, his voice breaking the silence. I nodded, slipping the knife into my pack. We retraced our steps, following the chalk marks back to the entrance. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. As we stepped out into the daylight, I felt a sense of relief mingled with a lingering unease. The cave had been a refuge from the storm, but it was also a place of mystery, a reminder of the secrets that lay hidden in the heart of the wilderness. We packed up our gear, eager to leave the cave and its shadows behind. But as we hiked back to our campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched, that unseen eyes had tracked our every move. The memory of the footsteps, the lantern, and the knife stayed with me, a haunting reminder of what we had found in the depths of the mountain. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of returning, of uncovering the truth behind the shadows in the cave. The forest was a place of wonder and mystery, and I was drawn to it, compelled by the desire to understand, to capture the unseen. And so, with the memory of the cave etched into my mind, I prepared for my next adventure, ready to face whatever lay beyond the edge of the light. Story 16. I've been working in the logging industry for over 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for the horrors we encountered in the depths of the Blackwood Forest. What started as a routine job turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams and makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name is Jack Holloway, and I've been a foreman for Redwood Timber Company since I was old enough to swing an axe. I've seen my fair share of strange things in the woods, but what happened in Blackwood Forest? Well, that's something else entirely. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. We had a contract to clear a section of old-growth forest that had never been touched by loggers before. The pay was good, and the crew was excited about the prospect of working in virgin territory. If only we'd known what was waiting for us in those ancient woods. We arrived at the site on a crisp autumn morning, the mist still clinging to the forest floor as we set up our base camp. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than any I'd seen before. As we unloaded our equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "You feel that, boss?" My second-in-command, Mike, asked as he came to stand beside me. I nodded, my eyes scanning the tree line. "Yeah, It's like the whole forest is holding its breath. We tried to shake off the unease and got to work. The first few days were uneventful, if you didn't count the eerie silence that seemed to blanket the forest. There were no birds singing, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. It was as if all the wildlife had simply vanished. It was on the fourth day that things started to get strange. We arrived at the clearing where we'd been working to find several of our chainsaws mangled beyond repair. At first, we thought it might be sabotage from environmental activists, but the damage didn't look like anything human hands could have done. The metal was twisted and bent as if it had been crushed by something incredibly strong. "What the hell could have done this?" one of the younger workers, Tommy, asked, his voice shaking slightly. I wished I had an answer for him. Instead, I radioed back to base camp for replacement equipment and told the crew to pair up and stay alert. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse. That night, we were awakened by blood-curdling screams coming from the edge of our camp. We rushed out of our tents to find Tommy writhing on the ground, clutching his leg. Deep gashes ran from his thigh to his ankle, as if he'd been clawed by some massive beast. As we scrambled to help Tommy and call for medical evacuation, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth around our camp, were footprints. But these weren't human footprints, or those of any animal I'd ever seen. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. The helicopter arrived to take Tommy to the hospital, and as it lifted off, its searchlight swept across the forest. For just a moment, I swear I saw something move between the trees. Something big. The next morning, the atmosphere in the camp was tense. Half the crew wanted to pack up and leave, contract be damned. The other half, driven by a mix of curiosity and stubbornness, wanted to stay and figure out what was going on. "We can't just leave," Mike argued. "Whatever's out there, it's dangerous. What if it hurts someone else?" In the end, we decided to stay, but we took precautions. We set up floodlights around the camp and established a watch rotation. No one was to go into the forest alone. For the next few days, an uneasy calm settled over us. We continued our work, but every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, had us on edge. And then, one evening, as the sun was setting, we heard it, a sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but then it grew, becoming a roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. It was followed by the sound of trees crashing down, as if something massive was moving through the forest towards us. "Everyone back to camp, now!" I shouted, and we ran for our lives. As we huddled in the center of our camp, surrounded by our equipment and floodlights, we saw them. Eyes. Dozens of pairs of eyes, reflecting the light back at us from the darkness between the trees. They were set high off the ground, much higher than any known animal in these parts, and then they emerged, creatures that defied explanation. They were huge, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. Their faces were a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with jaws that looked strong enough to crush bone. For a moment, everything was still. We stared at the creatures, and they stared back at us. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they attacked. What followed was chaos. The creatures moved with incredible speed and strength, tossing aside our heavy equipment as if it weighed nothing. Men screamed as they were picked up and thrown through the air. I saw Mike go down under the weight of one of the beasts, his cries cut short by a sickening crunch. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I could hear the creatures behind me, their roars mixing with the screams of my crew. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran, crashing through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks. Eventually, I found myself at the base of one of the massive old-growth trees. Without thinking, I started to climb. From my perch high in the branches, I watched in horror as the creatures systematically destroyed our camp. They moved with purpose, smashing our vehicles and equipment, obliterating any trace of our presence in their forest. As dawn broke, they melted back into the woods, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Of the 20 men in my crew, only a handful had survived the night. We were found later that day by a search and rescue team, babbling about monsters in the woods. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The official report blamed our injuries and the destruction of the camp on a freak storm and wild animal attacks. But I knew the truth, as did the other survivors. We had encroached on something ancient, something that didn't want us there. The forest had defended itself in a way none of us could have imagined. I left the logging industry after that, unable to face the thought of going back into the woods. But the memories of that night in Blackwood Forest have never left me. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear that bone-chilling roar in the distance. Years have passed, and I've never found a satisfactory explanation for what we encountered. But I've come to accept that there are things in this world that defy our understanding, forces of nature that we can't comprehend or control. I still love the outdoors, still feel drawn to the quiet of the forest, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the life that pulses through the trees and the earth, and I never, ever take nature for granted. So the next time you're hiking through an old forest, and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, remember my story. Remember that the woods are ancient and alive in ways we can't begin to fathom. And sometimes, when we push too far into places we don't belong, nature pushes back. As for me, I'll keep telling my story, hoping that others will listen and learn. Because once you've seen what lurks in the shadows of the deep woods, there's no going back. The forest isn't just a collection of trees anymore. It's a reminder that our world is full of mysteries, and that some secrets are meant to stay hidden in the dark places where humans fear to tread. But if you do venture into the wild places of the world, tread lightly and with respect. And if you hear a sound that doesn't belong, or see movement where there should be none, don't dismiss it. Because in the heart of the forest, there are wonders and terrors beyond our wildest imaginations, waiting to be discovered or to discover us. Story 17. I've been a forest ranger for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. The night when the usual symphony of crickets and owls fell eerily silent, and something else took center stage in these woods I thought I knew so well. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath forms little clouds in front of your face, and the leaves crunch satisfyingly under your boots. I was doing my usual night patrol, flashlight in hand, checking for any signs of illegal campers or poachers. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow through the canopy of trees, creating a patchwork of shadows on the forest floor. I'd been walking for about an hour when I first noticed something was off. The night sounds I'd grown accustomed to over the years had gradually faded away. No chirping insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. I paused, my senses on high alert. In all my years patrolling these woods, I'd never experienced such complete silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when I heard it, a scream. But not just any scream. This was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a mix between a human shriek and an animal's roar, echoing through the trees and sending shivers down my spine. My hand instinctively went to the radio at my belt, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That I heard a weird noise. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I'd convinced myself it was probably just some animal in distress, maybe an injured deer or a fox caught in a trap, but deep down, a part of me knew this was something else entirely. I moved cautiously in the direction of the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The beam caught something on the ground and I froze. There, in the soft earth, was a footprint, but this was no ordinary animal track. It was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct toe impressions that looked almost human-like. My heart began to race. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every ranger has. Tales of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever you want to call it. But I'd always dismissed them as campfire stories or the delusions of over-eager cryptid hunters. Now, staring at this impossible footprint, I wasn't so sure. I followed the tracks, my curiosity overriding my common sense. They led me deeper into the forest, to areas I rarely patrolled due to their remoteness. As I walked, I noticed more signs of something. Broken branches high up on the trees, far higher than any known animal in these parts could reach. Bark stripped away in long, vertical gouges that looked disturbingly like claw marks. The silence of the forest was now oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. I knew I should turn back, call for backup, do anything other than continue alone into this increasingly unsettling situation. But something drove me forward, a mix of professional duty and morbid curiosity. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing. The moonlight illuminated the area, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. The clearing looked like a battlefield. Trees were uprooted or snapped in half like twigs. The ground was torn up as if by some massive force. And there, in the center of it all, was a patch of long, coarse hair caught on a broken branch. I approached slowly, my hand shaking as I reached out to touch the hair. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too coarse for a bear, too long for a wolf. As I examined it, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A tall, hulking figure at the edge of the clearing. It was covered in dark fur, standing upright on two legs. But before I could process what I was seeing, it was gone, melting into the shadows with surprising speed for something so large. My training kicked in, and I found myself running back the way I came. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted through the underbrush, my lungs burning with each breath. I could hear something moving through the forest parallel to me, keeping pace effortlessly. Whatever it was fast. I burst out of the tree line near my parked ranger vehicle, fumbling with my keys as I practically dove inside. As I started the engine, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, stood the figure I'd seen in the clearing. In the harsh glare of my headlights, I could make out more details. It was easily 8 feet tall, with a broad, muscular frame covered in dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and ape-like features, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. For a moment, we stared at each other. I was frozen, my hand on the gear shift, unable to look away. Then, as if making a decision, the creature turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a hallucination, a product of too many long nights and not enough sleep. But I knew what I'd seen. What I'd heard, what I'd found in that clearing. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. I debated with myself the entire way about what to do. Should I report what happened? Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the service, maybe even lose my job. But could I really keep this to myself? In the end, I compromised. I filed a report about unusual animal activity and some forest damage, but left out the more unbelievable aspects of my encounter. I kept the tuft of hair I'd found, hidden away in a sealed bag in my locker. Maybe someday I'd have it analyzed, find out what it really was. Or maybe it was better not knowing for sure. The weeks that followed were challenging. I found myself jumping at shadows, scrutinizing every sound in the forest. My colleagues noticed my change in behavior, but I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about a bad night's sleep. I went back to that clearing once, in the light of day. The damage was still there, broken trees and torn up ground, but it all seemed less ominous under the warm sun. I searched for more concrete evidence, something that would prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But there was nothing. No more footprints, no more hair, just the lingering feeling that the forest was keeping secrets. As time passed, I began to doubt my own memory of that night. Had it really happened the way I remembered? Or had my mind exaggerated things, turned a bear sighting or some other mundane encounter into something more fantastic? But then there are nights when I'm out on patrol and the forest goes quiet that I remember. I remember the silence, the footprints, the figure in the clearing, and I know that there are things in these woods that defy explanation, things that remind us that we don't know everything about the world we live in. I still do my job, patrolling the forest and keeping it safe, but now I do it with a newfound respect for the unknown and a keen awareness that I'm not always the top of the food chain out here. Some nights, when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself scanning the tree line, wondering if I'll catch another glimpse of whatever it was I saw that night. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear something moving out there in the darkness, something big, something that doesn't want to be seen, and I'm reminded that in the vast wilderness there are still mysteries waiting to be uncovered, if we're brave enough or foolish enough to look for them. Story 18. I've been an avid camper all my life, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in the Cascades. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip, a chance for my buddy Mike and me to escape the city and reconnect with nature. Instead, it became a night that would haunt my dreams for years to come. The day had started perfectly. Mike and I had hiked deep into the wilderness, far from any marked trails or campgrounds. We wanted solitude, and we found it in a small clearing nestled between towering pines and a babbling creek. As the sun began to set, we set up our tent, built a small fire, and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful night under the stars. The first few hours were idyllic. We roasted marshmallows, swapped stories, and marveled at the blanket of stars visible in the clear night sky. The only sounds were the crackling of our fire and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly the kind of tranquility we'd been seeking. We turned in around midnight, crawling into our tent and zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags. The night was cool but not uncomfortable, and I drifted off to sleep easily, lulled by the soft sounds of the forest. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when I first heard it, a snap of a twig, loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the night. My eyes flew open, but I remained still, straining my ears. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of something large moving just outside our tent. "Mike!" I whispered, my heart beginning to race. "Mike, wake up!" He stirred beside me, grumbling sleepily. "What's wrong?" "Shh," I hissed. "Listen." We both fell silent, and that's when we heard it clearly. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, far too close to our tent for comfort. Whatever was out there, it was big. Mike sat up slowly, his sleeping bag rustling. "Maybe it's a deer," he whispered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his doubt. I shook my head, though I knew he couldn't see me in the darkness. "Too big," I murmured, "and deer don't breathe like that." As if in response to our whispers, something bumped against the side of the tent. We both flinched, instinctively shrinking away from the canvas wall. The breathing grew louder, more labored. I could hear twigs snapping under heavy footfalls as the creature circled our tent. "What do we do?" Mike's voice was barely audible, tight with fear. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. "Maybe if we make some noise, it'll go away," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. But before we could act on that plan, a new sound froze us in place. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the snarl of a bear or the howl of a wolf. This was something different, something that sent primal fear coursing through my veins. The creature outside moved again, and suddenly our tent shook violently. We heard the clatter of our camping gear being knocked over, followed by the sound of fabric tearing. Something had ripped into our food bag, which we'd foolishly left just outside the tent. "We need to see what it is," I said, my finger hovering over the switch of my flashlight. Mike grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? What if it attacks?" "We can't just sit here," I argued. "We need to know what we're dealing with." Before Mike could protest further, I steeled my nerves and flicked on the flashlight. With my other hand, I slowly, cautiously, began to unzip the tent flap. The sound of the zipper seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. As I pulled the flap back, the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the area just outside our tent. What I saw in that moment is seared into my memory forever. A massive dark silhouette loomed over our campsite. It was hunched over our torn food bag, but at the sound of the tent opening, it straightened to its full height. And that height was terrifying. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The creature was covered in thick, matted fur, visible even in the limited light of my flashlight, but it was the eyes that truly paralyzed me with fear. 2 glowing orbs reflected the light, fixed directly on us. They were set in a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of human and animal features. The nose was broad and flat, the jaw protruding slightly, but there was an unsettling intelligence in those eyes, a cognizance that felt far too human. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other, 2 terrified campers and this impossible creature. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it turned and bolted into the forest. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls faded quickly, leaving us in stunned silence. Mike was the first to speak, his voice shaky. What the hell was that? I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what we'd just seen. A bear. No, it was too tall, too bipedal, some kind of huge ape. But there were no apes native to this part of the country. As the adrenaline began to subside, I became aware of how badly I was shaking. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know," I finally managed to say, "but we need to get out of here." We scrambled out of the tent, our eyes darting around the clearing, half expecting the creature to reappear at any moment. Our campsite was a mess. The food bag was shredded, its contents strewn across the ground. One of our camp chairs was overturned, and there were deep gouges in the earth where the creature had stood. "Look," Mike said, pointing at the ground. "Footprints." I directed my flashlight where he was indicating. There, pressed into the soft earth, were a series of enormous footprints. They were vaguely human-shaped, but much larger, with what looked like claw marks at the end of each toe. "We need to document this," I said, reaching for my phone to take a picture, but my pocket was empty. I'd left my phone in the tent. As I turned back to retrieve it, a sound stopped me in my tracks. A long, mournful howl echoed through the forest, sending shivers down my spine. It was answered by another howl, this one further away. "There's more than one," Mike whispered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. That was all it took to spur us into action. We abandoned any thought of packing up properly. We grabbed our backpacks, stuffed our sleeping bags inside, and took off down the trail, leaving the tent and the rest of our gear behind. We hiked through the night, our pace frantic, fueled by fear and adrenaline. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. We imagined glowing eyes watching us from the darkness, massive shapes moving just beyond the reach of our flashlights. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to illuminate the forest that we finally slowed our pace. We emerged from the tree line onto the parking lot where we'd left our car, exhausted and shaken, but alive. The drive back to the city was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. We tried to talk about what we'd seen, to make sense of it, but words failed us. How could we possibly explain what had happened? In the days and weeks that followed, we debated whether to report our experience, but who would believe us? We had no proof, no pictures, no video, not even our tent with its torn fabric and the strange footprints around it. We'd left it all behind in our panicked flight. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself doubting my own memories. Could it really have happened the way I remember? Was it just a bear, distorted by fear and darkness, into something more fantastic? But then I remember those eyes, that impossible height, the unmistakably bipedal gait as it ran into the forest, and I know, deep in my bones, that what we encountered that night was something beyond ordinary explanation. Mike and I still go camping, but never again in that part of the Cascades. And we're much more careful now, always in designated campgrounds, never too far from other people. Some might call it paranoia, but they weren't there that night. They didn't see what we saw. I often wonder about that creature, and others like it. Are they out there still, roaming the vast wilderness? How have they remained hidden for so long? And what would happen if one day they decided to stop hiding? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the forest the same way again. Behind every tree, in every shadow, I now see the potential for mystery, for the unknown. It's a reminder that no matter how much we think we've explored and explained our world, there are still secrets out there waiting to be discovered, or perhaps waiting to discover us. Ghost Story 19. I've captured countless images of wildlife in my career, but none have haunted me like the ones I took that day in the Olympus Mountains. What started as a routine expedition turned into an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As a wildlife photographer, I've spent years honing my craft, patiently waiting for the perfect shot of elusive creatures in their natural habitats. I've photographed everything from majestic elk to shy mountain lions, but I always dreamed of capturing something truly extraordinary. Little did I know that my wish was about to come true in the most unsettling way possible. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out into the dense forests of the Olympus Range. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and a light mist clung to the undergrowth, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. I'd heard rumors of unusual animal activity in the area, and I was determined to document whatever I could find. Hours passed as I trekked through the wilderness, my camera at the ready. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional distant call of a larger predator. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something odd. The usual wildlife seemed scarcer than normal, and there was a palpable tension in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was late afternoon when I first saw it. I was setting up my camera for a long exposure shot of a beautiful moss-covered rock formation when movement at the edge of my peripheral vision caught my attention. I turned, adjusting my telephoto lens to focus on a clearing about 100 yards away. What I saw through my viewfinder made my blood run cold. There, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was large, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in what appeared to be dark, matted fur. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. It stood upright on 2 legs, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. My hands shook as I snapped photo after photo, hardly daring to breathe. The creature moved with an eerie grace, gliding between the trees as if it were part of the forest itself. For a brief moment, it turned in my direction, and I caught a glimpse of its face. It was a visage that defied classification, neither fully animal nor human, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow with an inner intelligence. As quickly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the depths of the forest, leaving me alone with my racing heart and a camera full of impossible images. I stood rooted to the spot for what felt like hours, my mind struggling to process what I'd just witnessed. It couldn't be real, could it? Perhaps it was just a bear, distorted by the mist and my own overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. And I knew I had the proof on my camera. With shaking hands, I packed up my gear and began the long hike back to my campsite. The forest, which had always been a place of comfort for me, now felt oppressive and alien. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and the back of my neck prickled with the sensation of being watched. Back at my tent, I wasted no time connecting my camera to my laptop. As the images loaded, I held my breath, half expecting to see nothing but blurry shots of shadows and trees. But there it was in vivid detail, a creature that should not exist, captured forever in pixels and light. I spent hours poring over the photos, zooming in on every detail. The creature's fur, its muscular frame, the strange elongated fingers that ended in what looked like sharp claws. But it was the eyes that captivated me most. There was something in them that spoke of an intelligence far beyond that of any known animal. Sleep eluded me that night. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with questions. What was this creature? How had it remained hidden for so long? And most pressingly, what should I do with these photos? As a wildlife photographer, I had a responsibility to document and share my discoveries. But I also knew the potential consequences of releasing these images to the world. Would I be lauded as the person who provided definitive proof of an unknown species? Or would I be ridiculed, my reputation destroyed by claims of hoax or delusion? Morning came, and with it, a decision. I needed more evidence. One set of photos, no matter how clear, would not be enough to convince the scientific community. I had to go back to try and capture more images, perhaps even video footage. I spent the day preparing my equipment, checking and double-checking every piece of gear. As the sun began to set, I set out once more into the forest, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The clearing where I'd first spotted the creature was eerily quiet when I arrived. I set up my camera traps, motion-activated cameras that would capture anything that moved through the area. Then I found a hidden spot where I could observe without being seen, settled in, and waited. Hours passed. The forest grew dark, and a chill settled into my bones, but I remained vigilant, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that was neither growl nor speech, but something in between. My hand flew to my camera, but before I could raise it to my eye, something large crashed through the underbrush directly in front of me. In the dim moonlight, I saw the same towering figure from the day before, but this time it wasn't alone. A smaller but similarly shaped creature loped alongside it, moving with the same fluid grace. I held my breath, my finger poised over the shutter button. The creatures moved into the clearing, and I had a clear view of them both. The larger one, perhaps a male, was even more imposing up close. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur as it moved, and I could hear its heavy breathing. Just as I was about to take the shot, the unthinkable happened. My phone, forgotten in my pocket, began to vibrate loudly. The creatures ahead snapped in my direction, their eyes reflecting the faint moonlight like twin pairs of lanterns. Time seemed to stand still as we regarded each other. I was frozen in place, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they must hear it. Then, with a speed that belied their size, they turned and bounded back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they had come. I sat there for a long time, my body shaking with adrenaline and missed opportunity. When I finally found the courage to move, I collected my camera traps with trembling hands, praying that they had captured something, anything that could corroborate what I'd seen. The trek back to my campsite was a blur. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt exposed, vulnerable, acutely aware that I was in the domain of something far more powerful than myself. As soon as I reached my tent, I connected the camera traps to my laptop. Most of the footage showed nothing but empty forest and the occasional deer or raccoon. But on one camera, in a brief 10-second clip, I saw them. The two creatures moving through the clearing with that strange, fluid gait. The footage was grainy and dark, but it was undeniably the same beings I'd encountered. I sat back, my mind reeling. I had my proof. Not just photos this time, but video evidence of something that would shake the foundations of zoology and challenge our understanding of what exists in the wild places of our world. But as the initial excitement faded, a new feeling settled in, one of responsibility and of fear. What would happen if I released this footage? Would it lead to an invasion of this pristine wilderness by curiosity seekers and would-be monster hunters? Would it put these creatures, whatever they were, in danger? As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I made my decision. I carefully packed away my equipment, making sure the memory cards with the footage were secure. I would not rush to release this to the world. Instead, I would seek out experts I trusted, show them what I'd found, and let them help me decide the best course of action. As I drove away from the mountains, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Excitement at what I'd discovered, fear of the unknown, and a deep sense of wonder at the mysteries still hidden in the world around us. One thing was certain: I would never look at the wilderness the same way again. And I knew, deep in my heart, that I would return to those mountains. The creatures were out there, and their story was far from over. Story 20. We thought we'd found the perfect spot for our family camping trip. Secluded, scenic, and far from the crowds of more popular sites. But as the sun set on our first night, we realized we weren't alone in these woods. And whatever was out there with us was unlike anything we'd ever encountered before. I've always loved camping. There's something about disconnecting from the world and immersing yourself in nature that rejuvenates the soul. So when I suggested a family camping trip to my wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Ethan, 12, and Lily, 9, they were all on board. We decided to try a new spot this time, a remote campground in the Adirondacks that a colleague had recommended. "It's so peaceful," he'd said, "and you'll feel like you have the whole forest to yourself." How I wish now that we'd stuck to the more populated campsites. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the car packed to the brim with our tent, sleeping bags, coolers, and all the other essentials for a weekend in the wilderness. The campground was even more isolated than we'd expected. The narrow dirt road leading to it was barely visible, and we nearly missed the turnoff. When we finally pulled into the small clearing designated for camping, we were the only ones there. "Wow, Dad, we really do have the whole place to ourselves," Ethan exclaimed, his eyes wide with excitement as he took in the towering pines surrounding us. I grinned, feeling a sense of pride at having found such a perfect spot. "Looks like it, buddy. Let's get set up before it gets dark." We worked together to pitch our large family tent, Lily giggling as she struggled with the poles that were almost as tall as she was. Sarah organized our supplies while I got a fire going in the designated pit. As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, we roasted hot dogs over the fire and made s'mores, the kids' faces sticky with melted marshmallow and chocolate. It was a perfect evening. The air was crisp but not cold, filled with the scent of pine and wood smoke. The only sounds were the crackling of our fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. As we sat around the fire, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was exactly what we needed, time away from screens and schedules, just us and nature. If only I'd known then how quickly our peaceful retreat would turn into a nightmare. It was well past midnight when we finally crawled into our sleeping bags. The kids were exhausted from the drive and set up, and they fell asleep almost instantly. Sarah and I weren't far behind, lulled by the soft sounds of the forest night. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when the first howl jolted me awake. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be a wolf. But as my mind cleared and I heard it again, I realized this was unlike any wolf howl I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent chills down my spine. Sarah stirred beside me. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice tight with concern. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm for her sake. "Probably just some animal." But even as I said it, I knew this was no ordinary animal. The howl came again, closer this time, and was joined by another from a different direction. Whatever was out there, there was more than one of them. Ethan sat up in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, what's going on?" I opened my mouth to reassure him, but at that moment something large moved past our tent. The canvas wall bulged inward slightly, and we heard heavy breathing and the snap of twigs under significant weight. Lily woke up then, her small voice quavering. "Mommy, Daddy, I'm scared." Sarah pulled her close, whispering soothing words, but I could see the fear in her eyes as well. We were all terrified, huddled together in our suddenly fragile-feeling tent as unknown creatures prowled around us. For what felt like hours, we sat in tense silence, listening to the movements and vocalizations of whatever was out there. The howls continued intermittently, sometimes sounding like they were right next to the tent, other times farther away. Occasionally, we'd hear what sounded like communication between the creatures. A series of grunts and low, rumbling noises that were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent walls, the sounds gradually faded away. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until the normal sounds of the forest, birdsong and rustling leaves, returned. "Is it over?" Ethan whispered. I nodded, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "I think so. Let's take a look outside." Cautiously, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The clearing looked much as it had the night before, bathed in the soft light of early morning. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed details that made my blood run cold. Our campsite had been thoroughly ransacked. The coolers we'd left outside were overturned, their contents strewn across the ground. Our camping chairs were knocked over, and one had a large tear in the fabric seat. But most disturbing of all were the footprints. They were everywhere, pressed into the soft earth around our tent. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, and showed clear toe impressions that looked disturbingly human-like. But no human could have made prints that large, or have toes ending in what looked like claw marks. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, coming to stand beside me. What did this?" I shook my head, at a loss for words. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Could it have been bears? But bears didn't walk on two legs like this, and they certainly didn't howl like what we'd heard last night. The kids joined us, their eyes wide as they took in the destruction. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice shaking slightly, "those look like Bigfoot prints." Under normal circumstances, I would have laughed off such a suggestion. Bigfoot wasn't real. It was just a myth, a story told around campfires. But standing there, looking at those impossible footprints and remembering the sounds we'd heard in the night, I wasn't so sure anymore. "We need to leave," Sarah said firmly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Now," I nodded, the protective instinct for my family overriding any curiosity I might have felt. "You're right. Kids, help us pack up. We're going home." We worked quickly, throwing our belongings haphazardly into bags and the car. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see something large and hairy watching us. The feeling of being observed was palpable, raising the hair on the back of my neck. Just as we were about to pile into the car, Lily let out a small cry. "Dad! The tires!" I rushed to her side and felt my heart sink. All 4 tires were flat, each one sporting several deep punctures that looked like they'd been made by something sharp and curved, like claws. "Oh, no," I muttered, running my hand through my hair in frustration. We were trapped. Sarah put her hand on my arm, her face pale but determined. "The spare. We have a spare tire, right?" I nodded, hope flaring. "Yes, and the pump. If we can change just one tire, we can get out of here." We set to work immediately. I jacked up the car while Sarah kept the kids close, all of us jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. As I worked to change the tire, I could feel eyes on me. The sensation was so strong that I kept looking up, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. It felt like it took hours, but finally, we had one functional tire. It would have to be enough. "Everyone in the car now," I said, tossing the tools into the trunk. We piled in, and I started the engine, saying a silent prayer of thanks when it roared to life. As we began to move, slowly navigating the uneven ground with our 3 flat tires, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. There, partially hidden behind a large pine, was a figure. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. For a brief moment our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of recognition, not of the creature itself, but of the intelligence behind its gaze. This was no mindless animal. Whatever it was thinking, reasoning, watching us with clear intent. Then we rounded a bend in the road, and it was gone. The drive home was tense and quiet. We had to stop several times to reinflate our one good tire, each stop filled with nervous glances at the surrounding woods. It wasn't until we were back on the main highway, the forest receding behind us, that we all let out a collective sigh of relief. In the days and weeks that followed, we debated whether to report what had happened. In the end, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We had no proof beyond our own testimony, and the idea of attracting attention from cryptid hunters or skeptical authorities was unappealing. But we knew what we'd experienced. Our family camping trips now take place in well-populated state parks, and we always make sure there are other people nearby. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself listening for those eerie howls, and I wonder about what's out there in the deep woods, just beyond the reach of our understanding, waiting to be discovered, or perhaps hoping to remain hidden. Story 21. I've been hunting these woods for over 3 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that crisp autumn day. It started as a routine hunting trip, but by the end, I was left questioning everything I thought I knew about the wilderness and the creatures that inhabit it. The day began like any other hunting excursion. I woke before dawn, the air outside my cabin crisp and laden with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. I'd been tracking a particularly elusive buck for the past week, and I had a good feeling about today. Little did I know, I wasn't the only predator in these woods. I gathered my gear methodically, my trusted rifle, binoculars, and enough supplies for a full day in the forest. As I locked up the cabin and headed into the woods, the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to filter through the canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The trail I followed was barely visible, more of a game path than anything made by human feet. I moved silently, years of experience allowing me to navigate the underbrush without so much as a snapped twig to betray my presence. The forest was alive with the usual morning sounds, birdsong, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, the distant call of a hawk. It was mid-morning when I first noticed something was off. The woods had gone unusually quiet, not the silence of animals sensing a predator. I was used to that. This was different, a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I paused, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it, about 50 yards ahead, partially hidden by a fallen log. At first glance, I thought it was the buck I'd been tracking, but as I raised my binoculars for a closer look, my blood ran cold. It was a deer, all right, or what was left of one. The carcass had been torn apart in a way I'd never seen before. As an experienced hunter, I was familiar with how various predators took down their prey. This was something else entirely. The deer looked like it had been ripped limb from limb, its ribcage splayed open like a grotesque flower. I approached cautiously, my rifle at the ready. The kill was fresh, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Whatever had done this could still be nearby. As I examined the carcass, I noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Among the deer's tracks surrounding the area were other prints, massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct claw marks at the ends of what looked like toes. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bears were common in these parts, but this wasn't the work of any bear I'd ever encountered. The prints were too large, too human-like in their shape, and bears didn't typically rip apart their prey like this. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding. The forest had gone deathly quiet again. I scanned the tree line, my finger resting lightly on the trigger of my rifle. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to follow the tracks. It went against every instinct I had, every rule of safety I'd learned over the years. But curiosity and a stubborn refusal to let fear get the better of me drove me forward. I told myself I was just tracking an animal, like I'd done countless times before, but deep down, I knew this was different. The trail was easy to follow. Whatever had made those prints wasn't trying to hide its passage. Broken branches and disturbed undergrowth marked its path clearly. As I moved deeper into the forest, the terrain became rougher, the trees older and more gnarled. I realized I was in a part of the woods I'd never explored before, despite my years of hunting in the area. The tracks led me to the base of a steep hill. Here, the forest floor was rockier, and I lost the trail for a moment. As I cast about for signs of passage, a new sound reached my ears, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear's growl, or a cougar's. It was deeper, almost guttural, with an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. I looked up the hillside and froze. There, about halfway up the slope, was the mouth of a cave. It was partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, but unmistakable once you saw it. The tracks led directly to it. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn back, to get out of these woods and never return. But I'd come this far. I had to know what was in that cave. I began to climb, moving as quietly as I could over the loose rocks and tangled roots. As I got closer to the cave entrance, that feeling of being watched intensified. The air felt thick, heavy with an odor I couldn't quite place, musky and wild, like wet fur and something else, something alien. At the mouth of the cave, I paused to let my eyes adjust to the gloom. The entrance was larger than it had appeared from below, easily big enough for a man to walk through upright. As my vision adapted, I began to make out shapes in the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. Bones, piles of them, scattered across the cave floor. Most appeared to be from deer and other forest animals, but some were larger, and among them, glinting in the dim light that filtered through the cave mouth, were things that had no place in a wild animal's lair. A torn backpack, the twisted remains of what might have been a camping stove, and most chillingly, what looked like a human skull, partially crushed and yellowed with age. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard echoing off the cave walls. I took a step back, ready to flee, when a sound from deeper in the cave stopped me in my tracks. Something was moving in there, something big. I heard the scrape of claws on stone, the sound of heavy breathing. I raised my rifle, though I knew in my gut it would be little use against whatever was in there. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, I stood frozen at the mouth of the cave, my eyes straining to penetrate the darkness. Then I saw them, two eyes, reflecting what little light there was, glowing with an intelligence that was decidedly not animal. They were set in a face that I could barely make out, a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of human and beast. The creature was massive, its shape indistinct in the gloom but unmistakably bipedal. For a heartbeat, we stared at each other. I saw recognition in those eyes, a cold calculation that told me this thing, whatever it was as aware of me as I was of it. Then it moved, faster than anything that size had any right to move. I didn't think, I just ran. I half ran, half fell down the hillside, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush with a speed and agility that defied its size. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, my lungs burning, my legs pumping mechanically. I didn't dare look back. The sounds of pursuit were all around me, sometimes seeming to come from one direction, sometimes from another. Was there more than one? The thought spurred me to even greater speed. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, and I found myself back on familiar trails. I didn't stop running until I burst out of the tree line and saw my cabin. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. For a long time, I just stood there, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. As the adrenaline faded, doubt began to creep in. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could there really be something like that living in these woods? Something unknown to science, something that seemed to bridge the gap between man and beast? I spent a sleepless night in the cabin, jumping at every sound from the forest outside. When dawn came, I packed up my truck and left, unsure if I'd ever return. In the weeks and months that followed, I debated whether to report what I'd seen. In the end, I decided against it. Who would believe me? I had no proof, and the story sounded insane even to my own ears. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there in those woods. I still hunt, but never in those woods again. And on quiet nights, when the wind is right, I sometimes think I hear a distant, inhuman howl. It's a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk just beyond the edge of what we know. And sometimes, when we go looking for prey, we discover that we're the ones being hunted. Story 22. I've been fishing these waters for over 40 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that misty morning on Hollow Lake. What started as a routine fishing trip turned into a terrifying ordeal that would forever change how I viewed the wilderness and the creatures that inhabit it. My buddy Tom and I had been planning this trip for months. Hollow Lake was known for its excellent bass fishing, and its remote location promised a peaceful getaway from the hustle and bustle of city life. We arrived at the lake just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water's surface. The lake was shrouded in a thick morning mist, giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. As we unloaded our small motorboat from the trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual chorus of birdsong was noticeably absent, and the air felt heavy with an unnatural stillness. "You feel that, Tom?" I asked as we pushed the boat into the water. He nodded, his eyes scanning the shoreline. "Yeah, it's quiet, too quiet." We chalked it up to the early hour and the mist playing tricks on our senses. If only we had heeded that initial warning and turned back. As we motored out to the center of the lake, the mist began to thin, revealing the dense forest that surrounded the water on all sides. We cut the engine and drifted, casting our lines into the glassy surface. For the first hour or so, it was peaceful. We caught a few decent-sized bass, exchanging friendly banter and enjoying the solitude. It was mid-morning when we first noticed something strange, a ripple on the water's surface, too large to be a fish, moving against the current. At first, we dismissed it as a submerged log or perhaps a large turtle, but then we saw it again, closer this time. "Did you see that?" Tom's voice was tense, his eyes fixed on the spot where the ripple had been. I nodded, a chill running down my spine despite the warm morning sun. "Yeah, I saw it." "What do you think it was?" Before Tom could answer, we heard it. A loud splash from the far shore, followed by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. We both turned, straining our eyes to see through the remaining wisps of mist. That's when I saw it. A dark shape, massive and unlike anything I'd ever seen before, moving along the shoreline. It was partially obscured by the trees, but what I could see defied explanation. It seemed to be walking on two legs, but it was far too large to be human. Its movements were fluid and purposeful, nothing like a bear or any other animal I was familiar with. "Tom," I whispered, my voice shaking, "are you seeing this?" He nodded slowly, his face pale. "What the hell is that thing?" As if in response to Tom's question, the creature stopped. Even from this distance, I could feel its gaze upon us. A primal fear gripped me, the kind of fear our ancestors must have felt when faced with apex predators in the wild. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature plunged into the water. The splash was enormous, sending waves across the previously calm surface of the lake. "Start the engine!" I yelled, snapping out of my stunned state. "And we need to get out of here." Tom fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. I could have wept with relief at the sound. As we began to move, I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had entered the water. The surface was churning, a V-shaped wake heading straight for our boat. Whatever it was fast. "It's coming!" I shouted over the engine's roar. "Go faster." Tom pushed the throttle to its limit. our small boat bouncing roughly over the waves. I clung to the side, my knuckles white, watching in horror as the wake behind us grew closer. Suddenly, something large broke the surface just yards from our boat. In the split second before it submerged again, I caught a glimpse of dark, matted fur and a face that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of ape and man. Its eyes, intelligent and filled with an almost human malevolence, met mine for a brief moment before it disappeared beneath the waves. "What was that?" Tom's voice was high with panic. "Did you see it?" I couldn't find the words to respond. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. And yet, the wake behind our boat was very real, and it was getting closer. We were nearing the shore now, the boat launch where we'd started our ill-fated trip just visible through the trees. Safety was so close, and yet it felt miles away as I watched the creature gaining on us. Just as I thought we might make it, there was a tremendous impact from below. Our boat lurched violently, nearly capsizing. Tom was thrown from his seat, barely managing to hold onto the side of the boat. The engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no!" I frantically tried to restart it, but it was no use. We were dead in the water. The lake around us had gone still again, too still. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that the creature was right beneath us, waiting. "We need to swim for it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The shore's not far. If we go now, we might make it." Tom nodded, his face ashen. We both knew it was a long shot, but it was our only chance. On a count of 3, we dove into the water. The shock of the cold nearly took my breath away, but fear drove me forward. I swam harder than I ever had in my life, each stroke fueled by pure terror. I was about halfway to shore when I heard Tom scream. It was a sound of pure, primal fear, cut off abruptly with a splash. I turned in the water, my heart pounding. Tom was gone. The surface where he had been was churning, a dark stain spreading in the water. I wanted to go back, to help him somehow, but I knew it was too late. The creature, whatever it was, had taken him. Grief and terror propelled me forward. I swam until my muscles burned, expecting at any moment to feel something grab me from below. By some miracle, I made it to the shore. I scrambled up the bank, my waterlogged clothes weighing me down. I didn't stop running until I reached our truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the lake. There, at the edge of the water, stood the creature. In broad daylight, I could see it clearly now. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was a bizarre mix of ape-like features and something almost human, but it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Intelligent, aware, and filled with a cold curiosity. For a long moment, we stared at each other. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked back into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface. I drove away from Hollow Lake in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. The loss of Tom was a raw, aching wound, made all the more painful by the knowledge that I could never fully explain what had taken him. In the days and weeks that followed, I grappled with whether to report what had happened. In the end, I told a simplified version of events to the authorities, that Tom had fallen overboard and been pulled under by strong currents. I couldn't bring myself to tell the full truth. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what would happen if people did believe? Would they hunt the creature, destroy its habitat? As terrifying as my encounter had been, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been the intruders that day, not it. I've never returned to Hollow Lake, and I've given up fishing altogether. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself staring out at the darkness, remembering the intelligence in those inhuman eyes. It's a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the splash of something large moving through deep water, coming ever closer. Story 23. The forest has always been my sanctuary, a place of peace and adventure. But on that fateful night, it became a labyrinth of terror, where every shadow held a threat and every sound a warning. What began as a simple hiking trip turned into a nightmare that would haunt us forever. There were 5 of us: myself, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Tom and Lisa. We'd been planning this hike for months, eager to tackle one of the most challenging trails in the Appalachian Mountains. We were experienced hikers, or so we thought. Nothing could have prepared us for what awaited us in those ancient woods. The day started perfectly. The weather was ideal for hiking, cool and crisp, with a clear blue sky overhead. We set off early, our backpacks loaded with supplies, our spirits high with excitement. The trail was as challenging as we'd heard, winding up steep inclines and through dense forest. But we were loving every minute of it, the physical exertion and the breathtaking views making us feel alive and connected to nature. It was late afternoon when things started to go wrong. We should have reached the designated campsite by then, but there was no sign of it. The trail markers, which had been clear and frequent earlier, seemed to have disappeared. "Guys, I think we might be off the main trail," I said, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. Mike pulled out the map, frowning as he studied it. "That's impossible. We've been following the blazes all day." But as we looked around, it was clear that something was off. The forest seemed different here, older somehow. The trees were massive, their gnarled branches creating a canopy so thick that little sunlight penetrated. An eerie silence had fallen, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Maybe we should backtrack," Sarah suggested, a note of anxiety in her voice. We all agreed, but as we turned to retrace our steps, we quickly realized that nothing looked familiar. It was as if the forest itself had shifted around us, erasing our path. As the light began to fade, panic started to set in. We were lost, really lost, in a vast wilderness with night approaching fast. "We need to set up camp," Tom said, always the practical one. "It's too dangerous to keep wandering in the dark. We'll figure this out in the morning." Reluctantly, we agreed. We found a small clearing and quickly set up our tents. As darkness fell, an oppressive silence descended on the forest. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. It was as if all the wildlife had fled, leaving us alone in this primeval woodland. We huddled around our small campfire, trying to keep our spirits up with forced conversation and weak jokes, but there was no disguising the fear that had taken hold of us all. Something felt wrong about this place, something that went beyond simply being lost. It was well past midnight when we heard it, a scream, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was part animal roar, part human shriek, echoing through the trees and sending chills down our spines. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. Then another scream answered it from a different direction. "Get in the tents, now!" I hissed, dousing our fire. We scrambled into our tents, zipping them shut as if the thin fabric could protect us from whatever was out there. Sarah and Mike were in one tent, Tom and Lisa in another, and me alone in the third. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. The screams continued, sometimes sounding far away, sometimes terrifyingly close. They were joined by other sounds, the crack of breaking branches, the thud of heavy footfalls. Whatever was out there, there was more than one, and they were big. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night, the ripping of fabric. Tom and Lisa's terrified screams were quickly muffled, followed by the sound of something large crashing through the underbrush. "Run!" I yelled, bursting out of my tent. Mike and Sarah emerged from their tent, pale and shaking. We could see Tom and Lisa's tent, now nothing more than shredded nylon. There was no sign of our friends. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The sounds of pursuit were all around us, crashing through the undergrowth with inhuman speed and agility. As we ran, the forest seemed to come alive around us. Trees creaked and groaned, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. More than once, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, massive, shadowy figures flitting between the trees. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Finally, we stumbled into another small clearing. In the center stood an enormous oak tree, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter. Without discussing it, we made for the tree. There was a gap between two massive roots, just big enough for us to squeeze through. We huddled in the hollow beneath the tree, trying to catch our breath and make sense of what was happening. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but we could still hear those unearthly screams in the distance. "What are those things?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, "but they took Tom and Lisa. We need to find them." Mike shook his head. "Are you crazy? We barely escaped ourselves. We need to find a way out of here." As we argued in hushed whispers, a new sound reached our ears. It was a low, rumbling growl coming from just outside our hiding place. We fell silent, barely daring to breathe. A massive shape blocked the entrance to our hollow. In the dim moonlight filtering through the leaves, I could make out a hand, if you could call it that. It was huge, covered in dark, matted fur, with fingers ending in wickedly curved claws. The hand groped around the entrance, searching. Sarah stifled a scream, burying her face in Mike's chest. We pressed ourselves against the back of the hollow, praying that the creature couldn't reach us. After what felt like an eternity, the hand withdrew. We heard heavy footsteps moving away, but we didn't dare move. We spent the rest of the night in that hollow, jumping at every sound, wondering if our friends were still alive, if we would survive to see the dawn. As the first light of morning filtered through the trees, we cautiously emerged from our hiding place. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less alien. There was no sign of the creatures that had pursued us. No evidence of the terror we had experienced, save for the scratches on our skin and the haunted look in our eyes. We spent hours trying to find our way out of the forest. It was as if the landscape itself was shifting around us, landmarks appearing and disappearing, paths leading in circles. More than once, we thought we heard Tom or Lisa calling for help, but the voices always seemed to come from just beyond the next ridge or stand of trees, forever out of reach. It was late afternoon when we finally stumbled onto a marked trail. We followed it desperately, our relief palpable when we emerged from the forest to find our car right where we had left it, seemingly a lifetime ago. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Looking in the rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the tree line, something large, walking on two legs, melting back into the shadows of the forest. We debated long and hard about what to do. In the end, we reported Tom and Lisa as missing, but we didn't tell the full story of what had happened. Who would believe us? We had no proof, no evidence beyond our own terrified testimonies. I've never returned to those woods, and I know Mike and Sarah haven't either. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I hear those screams again, carried on the wind, and I wonder about Tom and Lisa, about what really lurks in the deep, dark places of the world. The forest was once my sanctuary. Now it's a reminder that there are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that exist in the shadows of our world, and sometimes, when we venture too far from the paths we know, we risk coming face to face with terrors we're not prepared to comprehend. Story 24. I've spent my entire career as a wildlife biologist, studying the hidden lives of animals in their natural habitats. But nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for what I discovered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. What began as a routine study turned into an encounter that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It all started with the rumors. Local hikers and campers had reported strange sightings in the area, glimpses of a large, unidentified creature moving through the underbrush, eerie howls echoing through the night, and massive, human-like footprints found in remote areas. Most of my colleagues dismissed these accounts as the product of overactive imaginations or misidentified bears, but something about the consistency of the reports intrigued me. I decided to set up a study. The plan was simple: place motion-activated cameras at strategic points throughout the forest and monitor them for several weeks. If there was something unusual out there, we'd capture it on film. The first few days of setup were uneventful. My assistant, Jake, and I hiked deep into the wilderness, carefully positioning our high-tech cameras in areas where sightings had been reported. The forest was beautiful but oppressive, the dense canopy blocking out much of the sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. "Do you really think we'll find anything?" Jake asked as we secured the last camera. I shrugged, trying to maintain a scientific detachment. "I don't know, but if there's something out there, these cameras will catch it." We left the forest that evening, planning to return in 2 weeks to collect the data. Those 2 weeks were some of the longest of my life. I found myself lying awake at night, imagining what our cameras might be capturing in the darkness of the forest. Finally, the day came to retrieve the cameras. Jake and I set out early, eager to see what, if anything, we had recorded. As we hiked to the first camera location, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The forest seemed different somehow, quieter, more watchful. We reached the first camera and found it intact. Relieved, I removed the memory card and inserted it into my tablet to review the footage. Most of it was what we expected: deer, raccoons, the occasional bear. But then, on the third night, something strange appeared. At first, it was just a shadow moving at the edge of the camera's range, but then it stepped into full view, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The creature was enormous, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. It moved with an uncanny grace for something so large, almost gliding between the trees. But it was the face that truly shocked me. In the infrared light of the camera, I could make out features that seemed to be a bizarre blend of ape and man. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at the screen. I shook my head, at a loss for words. I don't know. Let's check the other cameras." We moved quickly to the next location, only to find the camera smashed to pieces. The third camera was simply gone, ripped from the tree where we'd secured it. My scientific mind raced, trying to come up with rational explanations, but coming up short. It was at the fourth camera site that things took a truly terrifying turn. As we approached, I noticed deep gouges in the bark of nearby trees. They looked like claw marks, but they were far too high up to have been made by any known predator in the area. The camera was intact, but when we reviewed the footage, what we saw chilled me to the bone. The creature appeared again, this time much closer to the camera. It seemed to be examining the device, its head tilted in an almost human expression of curiosity. Then, slowly, deliberately, it reached out towards the camera. The last frame before the video cut out was a close-up of its face. Intelligent eyes, a flattened nose, and a mouth that seemed caught between a snarl and a grimace. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Now." I nodded, my own heart racing. But as we turned to leave, a sound stopped us in our tracks. A low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere behind us. We ran. There's no shame in admitting it. We ran as fast as we could through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. I could hear something crashing through the forest behind us, moving faster than anything that size had a right to. We burst out of the tree line near our parked car, gasping for breath. As Jake fumbled with the keys, I turned back towards the forest. There, just inside the shadows of the trees, stood the creature. In broad daylight, it was even more imposing. Its fur was a deep, reddish-brown, and its muscles rippled as it moved. But it was the eyes that truly captivated me. There was an intelligence there, an awareness that went beyond mere animal instinct. For a moment, we stared at each other. I felt as if I were looking at a missing link, a creature that straddled the line between humanity's past and present. Then, with a speed and grace that belied its size, it turned and melted back into the forest. The drive back to civilization was tense and quiet. Jake and I were both lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd seen. "What do we do now?" Jake finally asked as we neared the city limits. It was the question I'd been grappling with the entire drive. As a scientist, I had a responsibility to report our findings, to share this incredible discovery with the world. But another part of me hesitated. What would happen to the creature if its existence became known? Would it be hunted, captured, its habitat destroyed by curiosity seekers and would-be monster hunters? "We need to be careful," I said slowly. "We can't just rush into this." In the end, we decided to keep our discovery secret, at least for the time being. We would continue our research quietly, gathering more evidence before going public. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. Over the next few months, Jake and I made several more trips into the forest. We never saw the creature as clearly as we had that first day, but we found evidence of its presence, more footprints, tufts of fur caught on branches, and once a half-eaten deer carcass that had been cached high up in a tree, far higher than a bear could have managed. We also experienced other strange occurrences. Sometimes we'd feel as if we were being watched, only to turn and catch a glimpse of something large moving just out of sight. Other times, we'd hear vocalizations in the night, not quite human, not quite animal, but something in between. As our research progressed, I found myself becoming more and more fascinated by the creature. What was it? Some unknown species of great ape, a relic population of early hominids, or something else entirely? The more I learned, the more questions I had. But with that fascination came a growing sense of responsibility. I knew that if word of our discovery got out, it could mean the end of this creature's peaceful existence. The forest would be overrun with researchers, thrill seekers, and who knows what else. One night, as Jake and I sat around our campfire discussing our findings, we heard a now familiar rustle in the underbrush. We fell silent, straining our eyes in the darkness. There, just at the edge of the firelight, we saw it. The creature stood watching us, its eyes reflecting the firelight. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature picked up a large branch from the forest floor. It studied the branch for a moment, then began to strip the bark off with its claws. Once the branch was bare, it snapped it in half with seemingly little effort. The message was clear. "I am strong. I could hurt you if I wanted to." But it didn't hurt us. Instead, it gently placed the broken branch on the ground and melted back into the forest. That encounter was a turning point for me. I realized that this creature, whatever it was not just some animal to be studied and classified. It was an intelligent being, capable of complex thought and communication. In the years since that first encounter, I've continued my research, but always at a distance, always with respect. I've never published my findings or shared the video evidence we captured. Instead, I've dedicated myself to protecting the forest and its hidden inhabitants. Sometimes, on quiet nights in the wilderness, I think I hear distant vocalizations, not quite human, not quite animal. And I'm reminded that there are still mysteries in this world, things that exist beyond the boundaries of our scientific understanding. The creature in the forest remains a secret, known only to a select few. And perhaps that's how it should be. In a world where every inch has been mapped and every species catalogued, it's comforting to know that there are still wonders out there, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough or foolish enough to look for them.